Hello, my name is Jorge Besada and I am running for Congress in Washington State's 9th District. I'm a computer guy, a contractor at Microsoft. I was born in Cuba, a once prosperous country destroyed by economic fallacies which led many to adopt socialism and thus inevitably bring oppression and poverty upon themselves. The purpose of my campaign is to help bring about world peace and quick technological advancement so that among numerous other benefits, those of us who have 5 to 10 years left to live, like my parents, can even beat dying of old age. In order to do this, we must have a worldwide intellectual revolution where enough people understand how the world works. In other words, enough people familiarize themselves with the ideas of the economists usually referred to as the Austrian school, but more specifically, Ludwig von Mises and especially his great protege, 1974 Nobel Laureate in Economics, Friedrich Hayek. If mankind does not catch up to these and like-minded men's ideas in time, it will soon prove to be an evolutionary dead end. Our Homo lineage has spent millions of years segregating itself into groups for hunting, killing, raping, and sometimes cannibalizing each other. This whole thing about tolerance, respecting people's property or views, and the resulting commercial as opposed to militaristic order is relatively foreign to our tribalistic instincts. And if the proper understanding of the human animal and both the evolution and workings of the socioeconomic order does not spread fast enough, the economically ignorant and now nuclear-armed, slightly smarter tribalistic apes will keep rolling the dice, both with the economy and constant warmongering, until finally we destroy ourselves. Hayek was not very optimistic.
If the politicians do not destroy the world in the next 20 years, there's good hope. But the chance that they will destroy the world in the next 20 years, I'm afraid, is fairly high.
In many ways, the slightly smarter apes with nukes have been extremely fortunate to have even lasted this long without a civilization-ending nuclear war, as Daniel Ellsberg's book The Doomsday Machine so chillingly captures.
I learned and did not know that during the Eisenhower period, and this basically carried on, there was one war plan. And the war plan was that if there was a confrontation with the Russians in Berlin, whatever, maybe a small confrontation, then immediately we wipe out every city in China. I mean, the enormity of that idea takes a while to sink in. There was no alternative plan. That was the plan. Dan tried to develop alternative plans, but something like that remains. And a war could be set off just by inadvertence. There's case after case, many are discussed in the book, where we came extremely close to war just by inadvertence. Sometimes reckless actions on the part of leaders, but sometimes just accidents that happen. So one example that I didn't know that comes out in the book is when the first early warning system was established to detect incoming missiles, which would have been 1958, I guess.
Oh, 1960.
60, yeah. Turns out in this new sophisticated system to detect incoming missiles, in the first week of operation,
First day when it was turned off.
First day of operation.
Turned it off.
First day of operation, it detected a Russian missile attack with 99.9% certainty. First day of operation. And fortunately, nobody paid attention. But that kind of thing happens over and over, and the war plans are set up so that if somebody acts on that 99%, a billion people die. I mean, this is what we've been living with for 70 years. This is what we've been living with, and the page after page of the book contains graphic examples of this kind of, you can only call it insanity, and in fact,
there is only one simple and greatly misunderstood concept we have to properly grasp in order to make sense of the world, prevent our self-destruction, and within a few months quickly get mankind on a path to unimaginable socioeconomic prosperity. Selective evolution, or what is commonly referred to as natural selection. American biologist Theodosius Dobzhansky is known for having written a famous essay titled "Nothing in Biology Makes Sense Except in the Light of Evolution." Had he been familiar with the works of Friedrich Hayek, he would have dropped the "in biology" and realized that nothing makes sense except in the light of evolution. Hayek summarizes what creates the world and what is needed to understand it when he writes, quote, "We understand now that all enduring structures above the level of the simplest atoms and up to the brain and society are the results of and can be explained only in terms of processes of selective evolution." Whether we know much about natural selection or not, most of us associate it with people like Charles Darwin and the biological world of animals and living things. But natural selection also evolved the socioeconomic order and things like religions, laws, customs, language, and especially for our purposes, the many socioeconomic institutions that make up our modern economies like money, the banking and lending industries, interest rates, and more. In other words, at a fundamental level, natural selection creates both the biological as well as the socioeconomic orders, and is indispensable for understanding how they have come into existence and behave. Most people fear the concepts of natural selection and evolution with good reason. We don't really understand them, especially when it comes to the concept of race and socioeconomic achievement. Popular phrases associated with evolution, like Herbert Spencer's quote-unquote survival of the fittest, can scare us and keep us away from learning these vital subjects. Racist and erroneous ideologies like the ones that flourished in Hitler's Germany were also heavily influenced by faulty evolutionary thought and still play a significant role today. Natural selection is a simple process that creates order, which is what life is all about. Life can be seen as a sort of ongoing chain reaction of order. For example, if we could travel back in time about 4 billion years, there would have been no complex life forms like what we have today. There probably would have been what is commonly referred to as the chemical soup, which can be seen as a sort of chaotic sea of atoms and molecules. Out of this chemical soup, order and complexity arose, and eventually those molecules became ordered in a way that led to the first living cells. Complexity and order continued to increase, and eventually single cells were ordered in a way that led to the first multicellular life forms like plants, animals, and eventually us, humans. And now we have what the great British 19th century thinker Herbert Spencer referred to as the social organism. At the beginning of this process, we could say that there was zero or very little biomass. In other words, matter that was transformed and incorporated into these self-sustaining chain reactions of order and life. Living things don't just act randomly. They require precise knowledge and information to move the matter around in a way that becomes the wealth that keeps the order and thus life going. For billions of years, most information needed to create life and order was stored in genes, which changed very slowly via biological evolution. About 500 million years ago, life forms with brains began to emerge, which allowed information to be stored outside of genes, leading to more flexible and superior decision making. Eventually, life forms evolved that used their brains to be increasingly social and cooperate with others to reach even higher levels of productivity, fitness, competitiveness, which leads us to ourselves, anatomically modern man. Tribal man was doing relatively great compared to other species. Instead of hiding in the trees like his recent ancestors about 3 million years ago had done, he became the ultimate carnivorous predator. His brain tripled in size, he hunted megafauna to extinction and easily spread and adapted himself to every corner of the world. But with at most about 150 brains per tribe, and most people knowing how to do similar things, which meant information was more or less repeated across each brain, the social order had to remain relatively simple and backward or tribal. Then, during the last 30,000 or so years, something wonderful happened, something as momentous in the history of life as the emergence of biological evolution and genetics, the so-called market process, and its various components like trade, money, profit-loss calculation, economic competition, and interest rate coordination began to emerge and radically alter the way the social order worked. As wonderful as this was, information had been limited by the amount of human brains needed to store it and their ability to process it quickly and efficiently until computers and software came along, which brings us to the present, where software, artificial intelligence, and robotics are taking productivity and progress to new heights. The human body and the numerous systems that coordinate it, like the respiratory, nervous, and digestive systems, is the result of the actions of some 30 trillion cells, but obviously not the result of any conscious planning, designing, or conspiring by them. Thanks to the likes of Darwin and a modern understanding of genetics, we can understand how natural selection was the inadvertent sort of designer of such systems and complex order. Similarly, the global socioeconomic order, Spencer's social organism, is also coordinated by a system, by what Hayek and Mises refer to as the market process. The market process and the parts it is composed of, like money, prices, economic competition, interest rates, and the legal, religious, governmental frameworks that sustain it, are indeed the result of human action, but not the execution of any human design. The market process shares this trait with language, which is also a complex mechanism that is the result of human action, but was not consciously designed or invented by people or cells. Just like cells are unaware of why they act the way they do, and how natural selection has evolved them over billions of years to be parts of complex multicellular organisms, so is mankind ignorant of how processes of selective evolution have shaped the brain and society and created the market process which coordinates our actions to create the global socioeconomic order. Standing on Mises' shoulders, who provided him with a superb explanation of the workings of the economy and thus all aspects of the market process like money, prices, interest rates, etc., and much, much, much more, Hayek would go on to explain how in a few thousand years, culture and the market process had co-evolved to transform Homo sapiens from tribes of slightly smarter vicious apes into today's massively complex global socioeconomic order or social organism, thus arguably becoming the first person in the history of mankind to provide a complete evolutionary understanding of how the entire world works. Hayek is still so far ahead of our time that even today's leading thinkers, like renowned popular science writer Matt Ridley, whose last two books I highly recommend, The Evolution of Everything and How Innovation Works and Why It Flourishes in Freedom, are just beginning to catch up to the enormity of his insights. Ridley humbly acknowledges this in the following 2011 speech.
Somebody who came to Friedrich von Hayek comparatively late in life, I'm still catching up with him. Indeed, many of the insights that I thought I had discovered in my own readings and writings on the frontier of evolutionary biology and economics, it turns out Hayek had long before me. It's Hayek who first puts it all together.
On March 20th, 2019, Hayek's Nobel Memorial Prize was auctioned off in England's famed Sotheby's auction house, shattering the previous record for an online auction. It took decades before Darwin's monumental insights were widely appreciated by the Western world. Mankind finds itself in a similar situation with Hayek. So how did Hayek put it all together? Easy. Hayek realized that all enduring structures above the level of the simplest atoms and up to the brain and society require precise information to sustain, coordinate, expand their order. If one understands how information coordinates the biological and social orders, then one understands how the entire world works. It is that simple. Let's briefly try to get a feel for how Hayek saw the world and easily see how such wisdom is the key to making sense of and fixing our problems before it is too late. What follows next can be seen as divided into three parts. First, an overview of the market process and key aspects like money, inflation, economic competition, prices, the impossibility of socialism, interest rates, regulations, patents, and government. As we do so, we want to keep our eye on how information guides, creates, expands the socioeconomic order. Second, a brief introduction to Hayekian Cultural Evolution. And third, we apply the concepts discussed to untangle our pressing problems related to the economy, race, the coronavirus, and much that is related. Living things and society are self-perpetuating orders that are in continuous cycles of wealth production and consumption. Production involves the transformation or relocation of matter to create wealth, and consumption transforms or relocates wealth in a way that sustains or expands living things and their internal parts or orders. The sun sends us photons, energy, which the process of photosynthesis is able to store in chemical form. This energy is then used to power the cycles of production and consumption. If there is more production than consumption, then the order is profitable and thus has additional wealth with which to sustain itself for longer periods and or grow. For example, paramecium are single-celled life forms that produce food, wealth by swimming around and swallowing small bacteria, which they then consume by digesting and transforming them into the various nutrients, wealth needed to maintain and expand the paramecium's internal order and thus life. A more complex multicellular animal like a person is simply a collection of cells, which are themselves orders, which must be productive as a whole in order to produce and then consume the necessary wealth needed to nourish itself and the suborders, organs, cells, organelles it is composed of. Today, we not only have biological order, we also have social order, Herbert Spencer's social organism, which is rapidly growing and increasing its rate of production. In other words, the rate at which it transforms the Earth's matter into human usable wealth, order, life, biomass. Every year, increasingly automated building-sized machinery in the mining industries scrape or mine less than 10 cubic miles of matter from the Earth's massive volume of 260 billion cubic miles. This matter is collaboratively transformed or relocated by billions of people as trillions of dollars worth of wealth in terms of cars, computers, buildings, products, etc. are produced, thus increasing the world's economic pie of wealth and social order. These continuous cycles of production and consumption require precise knowledge and information. Processes of selective evolution can be said to have created two mechanisms for creating two types of orders or enduring structures, biological and social. The biological order is created via the well-known mechanism of biological evolution, with genes being like the sentences which store the information necessary to create, coordinate life and order. Mutations cause new genes and thus new information to arise, which leads to a different life form, which is then naturally selected, as it inadvertently competes with others, with the winner reproducing more and thus passing on more copies of the better adapted, fitter genes, information, design to latter generations. Production and consumption. Whenever a person works, he produces his labor and whatever wealth it creates, thus increasing the economic pie. If you are a freelancer, you produce a product, service, wealth, and trade it directly with society, customers, for money, and then trade the money back with society for the wealth you consume. If you work for a company, you produce your labor and trade it for money with your employer, who combines it with the labor of others to produce a product, service, wealth, which is then traded with society for the money from which your paycheck comes. Whether you are a freelancer, employer, or company, what is commonly referred to as sales revenue, your paycheck, is an estimate of the total amount of wealth produced. Costs, like employee wages, which will be used by them to consume wealth, food, energy, etc., are an estimate of how much wealth is consumed from the economic pie. And profits, which are the difference between sales revenue, production, and costs, consumption, are an estimate of by how much additional wealth the economic pie has grown. Again, a profitable order is an order, a cell, a person, or a company, that produces more than it consumes and is therefore self-sustaining and alive. The global economy or social organism is really a vast collection of orders, people, companies that are constantly trading with each other, nourishing each other, each trade taking each participant or order from an inferior to a superior state of well-being from its own perspective. Otherwise, the trade would not occur. When Carl trades $1 for a hamburger, he values the hamburger more than the dollar, and the restaurant values the dollar more than the hamburger. So the action of trading takes place, which, like all action which is not coerced, takes each participant from an inferior to a superior state of well-being from their own perspective. If a teenager uses a tree trimmer to produce one mowed lawn valued at $50 in 10 hours, his rate of production is $50 divided by 10 hours, $5 per hour. If next month he uses a riding lawnmower and mows the same lawn in 1 hour, he has increased his rate of production tenfold to $50 per hour. Profit-loss calculation motivates and enables all orders to guide their actions in the most profitable and thus pie-increasing way. And, very importantly, it also prevents orders, people, companies, from consuming more than what they produce, unless, of course, they are the benefactors of charity. The wealthier a person, company, order is, the more this order has produced in exchange for all this money and wealth. Bill Gates is one of the world's richest men because the social order he helped shape and successfully manage, Microsoft, has been one of the most productive in the world. We know this is the case because billions of human beings traded their money and wealth for its products and services. The production of wealth requires the consumption of wealth. For example, if 10,000 men are to spend 2 years producing an airplane factory, they must consume or use the concrete, materials, food, energy, transportation, shelter, wealth that they, as well as their dependents and family, need while they produce the factory. In other words, there can be no production if there does not already exist enough wealth that can be consumed while production takes place. Money. More money does not equal more wealth. Imagine if everyone in the world suddenly had an extra $1 billion. Would this make society wealthier? No. The amount of real wealth, goods and services, has not increased by a single toothpick. It would actually lead to less wealth since many people would stop working, producing, seeing their newfound fortune. Would the 10,000 men above be able to produce the factory if instead of having real wealth to use and consume, had to consume pieces of paper with dead presidents on them? Of course not. More money leads to and enables higher prices. For example, if there were 1,000 people in an island, we'll call it Blue Isle, and each has $100 for a total of $100,000 in the island, can anything sell for $200,000? Of course not. Even if they all combine their money, such a transaction could not happen because there isn't enough money. But what if each person had $500 so that there are now a total of $500,000? Then yes, obviously, prices could go up to 500,000. So for general prices to go up, there has to be more money. And who creates the money and is ultimately responsible for a general increase in prices? Generally speaking, today all money is created by governments via their central banks, the Federal Reserve in the United States, and they are thus responsible for the price increases. Let's say you print yourself $1,000 trillion and start offering people in the USA's West Coast ridiculous amounts of money for their goods, property, wealth. You buy all the wealth in California, Washington, Oregon. As this is happening, Americans are growing richer in terms of money, but poorer in terms of what really matters: homes, property, wealth. At some point, you make it to Florida. By this time, it will be packed with about 300 million Americans and perhaps the $1,000 trillion or more you kept offering people. The price of wealth tends to be the amount of money that is offered in exchange for it, given all the other things the money could be traded for. With so much money and so little wealth left, the price of everything would be astronomical, and people would be much poorer given that you are the one that possesses most of the wealth in the country. Assuming the total amount of money remains stable, if the economy wealth is expanding, which can only happen if the rate at which goods, services, wealth is produced is faster than the rate at which it is consumed, we expect general prices to go down because the money will sort of get divided among more goods and wealth, so less money per item means a lower price. This last point is of vital importance. Under normal, ideal circumstances, as the economy grows, we should expect prices to go down and people's savings to buy them more in the future. If the amount of wealth remains stable or grows slower than the amount or supply of money, then we have more money per item, thus higher prices. Let's go over a final and very important example. Keep your eye on how much wealth is being produced and consumed and the relationship between the quantity of money, wealth, and thus prices. Let's say Alan prints himself another 100,000, which is enough to hire half the people in Blue Isle for 3 months while they build him a small castle. Alan thinks this is a great idea. He is paying some people more than what they were making before. There were also a few unemployed or unmotivated to work people before, but he is offering enough money to get everyone working, thus achieving quote-unquote full employment. Prior to trading their labor for Alan's paper and money, people were producing stuff that they either wanted, needed to consume themselves, or could be sold and traded to others who obviously wanted or needed them to consume them. They were producing socially desired or order life creating and sustaining stuff like oranges, apples, haircuts, blankets, baskets, etc. The day half the population begins working on Alan's castle, the island's economy begins to lose half of its socially desired stuff and wealth, since half the population is no longer creating it, and begins increasing the amount of rocks, ladders, and other things for Alan's castle. These things are not socially desirable or order creating and life sustaining wealth, as judged calculated by the inhabitants. Since the existing 100,000 will be distributed over half as many socially desirable goods, this would eventually motivate their prices to about double. However, since Allen is further doubling the money supply as he pays people using his newly printed 100,000 on the last days of castle making, when half the population is still working on his castle and they have also spent most of the new 100,000, prices would nearly double once again, making them about 4 times higher than they were before Allen came up with this wonderful idea. It should be easy to see that Allen has reordered society in an inferior way. Everyone is working and making more money than before, but the unavoidable reality that they are ordered in a less productive way reflects itself in the much higher prices and smaller amount of wealth on average that each can consume. Ideally, people now lose their jobs, and instead of working on the easily identifiable yet disastrous plan laid out by Allen, for a few days there appears to be chaos as people discover superior plans and likely transition to their old trades or jobs, thus once again reordering society in a far, far more productive way. However, the people are economically ignorant, so they tell Allen, "Can you hire us again to make the castle bigger? You pay us more than what we were making before. You are about to create massive unemployment." Allen thinks to himself, "Gosh, it is a good thing that I am creating money and preventing massive unemployment and chaos. Obviously, I must keep providing liquidity." So the relative suffering continues. Had Allen been a bad king, who instead of creating money to acquire the necessary wealth to create his castle, simply taxed people at a rate of 50%, the people's living standards would have suffered similarly, but they would have easily understood the fact that their wealth was taken from them for the creation of things they didn't want or benefit from for a hopefully more obvious massive loss. Next, I will say some things that criticize our mainstream economics establishment. Although you see me in front of a Federal Reserve building in a rather protest-like pose, I do not believe that the Fed and our mainstream economics establishment is some cartoonish cabal of bad guys. Not at all. What I do think is that they are very wrong, similar to how Karl Marx and the communists were wrong. The creation of money by governments is just a hidden tax that transfers wealth from savers and society at large to the people who get the newly created money. For example, let's say you have saved 1,000, which can buy you 1,000 items at $1 each. The government via the central bank, the Federal Reserve in the US, and a convoluted process eventually creates billions of dollars which are given to the newly created Space Force military personnel so they can trade them for the wealth they need to consume and live. And because of this money creation, prices go up 5% so that each item now costs $1.05. And your saved or future earned 1,000 can only buy you 952 items instead of the 1,000 items. The 48 items or wealth, about 5%, that you and other taxpayers can no longer obtain is the exact amount of wealth that the Space Force personnel got to consume. Again, money is not the same thing as wealth. When governments create money, they are simply creating an additional tax or transfer of wealth from savers and the public at large to those who get the money. The following graph helps us understand how when the US was still on the gold standard, since gold can't be increased by adding zeros at the end of bars, this prevented the government from acquiring additional wealth taxes by just creating the money, thus prices had a slight downward trend until 1971 when the US completely abandoned the gold standard. Up to 1971, the US would give foreign governments an ounce of gold per $35. But in order to acquire enough wealth to sustain the costly Vietnam War, as well as grow a rapidly increasing welfare system, the US was creating more dollars than what it could honestly exchange to gold. French President Charles de Gaulle, who wanted the war to end, knew that this money and debt creation was allowing the US to dishonestly acquire the needed wealth to finance the war, so he demanded many dollars be exchanged into gold. The United States had enough gold to pay for France, but was running very low on gold and knew it could not meet further obligations, so it just completely stopped the dollar to gold convertibility and thus the end to the gold standard. Had the US government tried to obtain this wealth not via money creation, inflation, but by raising taxes directly, chances are Americans would not have gone along. Thus, from 1971 onward, the US government, thanks to the Fed, has been able to additionally tax worker savers, thus causing prices to rapidly increase instead of going down. If you look very carefully at the graph, you will notice two rapid increases in prices, one occurring during the American Civil War, 1861 to 1865, and another during the First World War, 1914 to 1918. During wars, tribalistic politicians, ideologues always resort to the price increasing money creation to acquire the wealth needed to feed, clothe, nourish the war effort. Because if they had to get the wealth directly from taxes, the public would more easily factor the true cost of the tribalistic warmongering and likely bring an end to such slaughters. This next graph shows how from early March to mid-May 2020, due to the coronavirus scare, the Federal Reserve has created about $3 trillion, which will be given to people and businesses so they can exchange this money for the wealth they can consume. Much of this will be unemployment benefits, which will motivate many to not even look for work and thus continue to be pure consumers. Thus, overall, the $3 trillion is leading to a rapid shrinking of the economy and accelerating rise in prices. Again, this is just a transfer of wealth from workers, seniors, some, to others as the economy continues to shrink and prices rise. If the Federal Reserve continues to create money at this rate or faster, this will eventually lead to a hyperinflationary chaos as happened in Germany after World War I, when the German government kept rapidly creating money, not wealth obviously, to pay for war reparations, military pensions, and the countless things the socialist-minded, economically ignorant population always expects their governments to accomplish. Trade, money, and the division of labor and information. Trade and money led to the division of labor and information, which allowed the social order to efficiently compartmentalize information in only the brains that needed it, and also accumulate a virtually limitless amount of information with which to continuously restructure itself in increasingly more productive and advanced ways. For example, Mark's brain contains knowledge of how to get coconuts and process them to create pastries. Tom's brain contains knowledge of how to find the best vines and weave them together to make baskets. Jim's of where to find rocks, which when split can create sharp knives, and how to sharpen them. When Mark trades his pastries for Tom's baskets and Jim's knives, he is a benefactor of all the knowledge needed to create those items, yet he only had to know how to make his pastries. Unlike the tribal social order, where knowledge is inefficiently repeated across every brain, trade allows for information to be efficiently stored fewer times, freeing up more brains to contain more information. We can envision 1,000 men producing and trading 1,000 different types of items, requiring 1,000 times more information, which without trade and the division of information that it enables would have been impossible to achieve in a tribal society. Also, when Mark trades his pastries for the baskets and knives, he can now make less trips to gather coconuts by using the baskets and process them faster by using the knives, and thus increase his rate of production from 2 to 10 pastries per day. The pastry making process has become more productive and also more complex because it was enabled by basket and knife making knowledge. We now have a never-ending cycle of increased rate of production and complexity, leading to population growth, more brains, leading to an increased rate of production and complexity, leading once again to more brains, once again leading to where we are today, with nearly 8 billion people and the inability to fully trace the knowledge that enabled the creation of anything. For example, a web designer can trade his services, which are dependent on web design information that reside in his brain, for money, and then trade the money for any of the billions of products and services that exist in the world and are likewise dependent on information spread throughout the world. The websites he creates are also enabled by all the information that enable the quote-unquote factors of production he used to create them, like his computer, the monitor, keyboard, software, electricity, the internet, etc., which themselves are enabled by all the information that enable their factors of production, like the computer's memory, the processor, and so on. Everything that is produced today is the result of an interdependence of information that spans millions of minds, not just in the present, but in the past as well, because wealth that is currently being produced and consumed is dependent on tools and factors of production and information provided further in the past. When he upgrades his to a better computer, the information that enable these improvements also contribute to and enable the improvement of his website production process. Without money, how would a heart surgeon trade his costly services for toothpicks? Without trade or money, this division of labor and information, as well as the intertemporal cooperation, interlocking, or stacking of information just described, and the ability to do profit and loss calculation to ensure that each order guides its actions in a manner that produces more than it consumes, would not exist, and neither would our social order which depends on it. Your life, the wealth you consume, the entire global economy, and thus all of human civilization, is the inadvertent result of a simple concept, or better said, tradition. The concept or tradition of private property. Private property means that a person owns and has the freedom to use his property as he desires or calculates. Our freedom to trade our private property with anyone in the entire planet transforms billions of free people into a global supercomputer where all companies are motivated to innovate and learn from each other, thus inadvertently cooperate to discover superior information with which to serve customers and reorder all of mankind. For example, it is the freedom of customers to buy electric vehicles with the latest technologies from any company in the world that motivates all other auto manufacturers in the world to copy and thus spread the latest and greatest innovations throughout the world. Companies that don't successfully compete, innovate, and learn won't get enough revenue to pay a competitive wage, motivating employees to once again use their freedom to trade, this time their labor, to quit and join the increasingly better informed, higher paying companies. This both competitive and cooperative process continuously innovates and reorders labor and resources in the most productive and prosperous way. Just like in the Olympics, we can discover the best athletes in the world due to global competition. So does free trade among all nations, peoples, orders allows the best ideas to compete and spread globally, thus ensuring the best possible global order. As cost-cutting ideas emerge and inevitably spread via competition, leading prices to continuously fall, new profitable ideas easily arise and once again spread via competition in an endless cycle of knowledge generation and innovation. For example, computers were once very expensive, but once the price of them came down enough, people easily realized that every home could have them, which gave birth to our computerized world and the internet and all the great things that flow from it. The more wealth is produced, the more wealth has to be offered in exchange for labor as entrepreneurs, companies, and orders in general compete against each other for the labor they need, which helps explain why the economic pie grows from everyone. We should also quickly add that morals are simply ways of acting. They are knowledge and information, which just like most knowledge, emerges and spreads via economic competition. Companies that hire, nourish, or trade with lazy, disrespectful, or corrupt people will be less competitive and be inevitably pressured to hire people with better morals, which in turn forces everyone to be respectful and hardworking regardless of race, sex, etc. Similarly, it is hardworking, tolerant, courteous people who, thanks to competition, inadvertently and inevitably force everyone else to be likewise. As Friedrich Hayek tells us, competition is, after all, always a process in which a small number make it necessary for larger numbers to do what they do not like, be it to work harder, to change habits, or to devote a degree of attention, continuous application, or regularity to their work, which without competition would not be needed. As millions of Italians, Britons, Germans, and other immigrants from all over the world came to America, it was ultimately the competition which grows from private property and thus individual liberty and freedom, which stripped these people of their otherwise nationalistic, ethnocentric, tribalistic identities and evolved what came to be seen as the classic American character or ethos of wanting to be seen as a reputable, honest businessman or professional who treats everyone with respect and wears a business suit as opposed to older religious, ethnocentric dresses. So not only does private property turn on or lead to economic competition on other aspects of the market process and resulting social order and civilization, it also civilizes our morals. Next, a few words about prices. How much wealth had to be consumed in order to produce a gallon of gasoline that sells in Seattle for $3.50, or a pound of beef that sells in a store in Miami for $5.35. We can't know for sure. However, we can be fairly certain that it was less than the advertised price, which on average must include the costs. The price of any item in the world lets us know that there is an order at that particular place and time that is coordinated by information that can produce the item while consuming less than the advertised price. That is amazing. This allows goods to be purchased and combined in a manner that ensures that the combination, like a car, can easily have a price set that properly accounts for the costs and consumption of the whole, like the car, by just adding the prices of the parts used to produce it, the wheels, the glass, the robotics, the labor, etc. Parts which themselves had a price set that included their own cost and consumption and so on. Each part input managed ordered by entrepreneurs with highly specialized time and place specific information who are always using profit and loss calculation to ensure that they are increasing the economic pie. The concept of private property plays a vital role here as well. It is not until things are privately owned that they are coordinated by brains or CPUs that are incentivized to use or reorder them in the most productive and profitable way possible. In order to have life, the social order must be coordinated by information that leads to more production than consumption. This information and coordination is impossible to achieve by governments and central planners, regardless of the genius of their experts or their good intentions. The following simple example suffices to show this. A restaurant in Miami sells a burger for $8. The $8 price provides vital information. Perhaps $1 might be profit, and $7 will be spending costs. In other words, in the necessary consumption or use of wealth needed to produce the burger, things like labor and everything the employees will consume at home, the food and energy, etc., thanks to their paychecks that came from the $7 per burger. Businessmen discovered 1. That there are enough customers nearby willing to patronize the restaurant at the $8 per burger price, thus providing a superior alternative to society. And he also discovered 2. How to reorder $7 worth of stuff, labor, supplies, etc. to produce the burger. If he sets prices too high, customers will choose other superior competing options. If too low, they might not cover costs and cause the business to consume more than it produces, leading to an overall shrinking of the economic pie and thus go out of business. Communism can't work because only businessmen dispersed throughout society are at the right time and place needed to discover people's desires and the information needed to properly set prices and thus create a profitable order, an order that produces more than it consumes. It is important to envision the socioeconomic order as it really exists, as if looked at from high above. Envision people coming together apart as companies and orders emerge and dissolve in ever-changing conditions. Superior information arising and restructuring the social order thanks to competition. As orders and companies get more productive, they lure other people to trade with and join them by offering more money and wealth for their labor relative to other companies and orders, eventually causing the least productive orders to sort of dissolve as their factors of production like labor, buildings, etc. are bid away to be parts of the more productive plans and orders. A sort of swarm intelligence emerges as the all-pervasive public quickly nourishes the growth and spread of superior orders, companies, information, and inadvertently expanding the worldwide division of labor and information. As entire neighborhoods, cities morph themselves in specialized ways as complementary pieces of information segregate themselves in distinct geographical locations, like the software industry in Silicon Valley, California, and manufacturing in Guangdong, southern China. As Mises reminds us, the division of labor is a fundamental principle of all forms of life. The division of labor is a pattern or way which natural selection rediscovers to enable smaller units or orders to efficiently compartmentalize labor and information as they contribute to and are nourished by a larger organism they become parts of. Organelles become parts of cells, cells become parts of organs, humans become parts of the social organism. Governmental public sector orders, being coercive monopolies which get their life and wealth through taxes and compulsion, are immune to this competitive information sharing and spreading incentives and pressures which motivate the private sector and companies to be efficient, innovative, and hardworking. This helps one understand how communism, which abolishes competing private companies and replaces them with a single competition-less monopolistic bureaucracy run by experts, leads to a massive lack in production and innovation and eventually socioeconomic chaos and starvation as the economic pie continuously shrinks, as has happened in every country that consciously attempts communism and socialism, like my native Cuba, or inadvertently drifts in that direction as their inefficient governments and public sectors get bigger and bigger and bigger, like the United States. Central plans can't work if people are free not to go along with them, so they inevitably require compulsion and tyranny. For example, it is a criminal act in a communist country like my native Cuba to start a business. In other words, to attempt a superior restructuring of society because it interferes with the plans of the quote-unquote experts who run the government. It is also a criminal act everywhere to not pay taxes that sustain public sector bureaucracies like public education. So there is little incentive or wealth to sustain other, more desirable, superior competing alternatives. For example, the New York City monopolistic school bureaucracy consumes about $29,000 per year to educate a K-12 student. Refusing to pay a single dollar that goes to this coercive bureaucracy is a criminal act. Taxes and all transfers of wealth from the private sector to government, besides being an obvious burden to the human beings that had to sacrifice a part of their lives to earn such wealth and now have less wealth to trade for the things they want, simply destroy the private sector jobs that taxed-away spending would have sustained in the private sector and replaces such productive and efficient and pie-increasing jobs for inefficient government ones, or worse, things like wars and militarism. The former Soviet Union had plenty of highly educated scientists and experts whose plans required the coercion of millions, but they were thoroughly crushed by free Americans and their competitive knowledge discovery as they worked hard towards the American dream. Socialist regimes and public sectors in general also face an incentive problem. In free societies or the private sector, each person or company is incentivized to be as productive as possible and keep inefficiencies to a minimum, since he owns and keeps the additional wealth or losses. On the other hand, the government employee or bureaucrat gets the same pay, ability to later consume, whether his department did a good job, produced a lot, or not, and is also not risking his own wealth, since that comes from the taxpayer. The image below is one of the most powerful means for explaining the difference between the competitive private orders, South Korea, and monopolistic government orders, North Korea. Again, keep your eye on how information arises, spreads, and continuously restructures the social order. Regulations are just information not subject to continuous improvement via competition, so they paralyze entire industries, driving up costs. Compare the increasingly regulated and paralyzed healthcare sector, which has grown from consuming about 5% of the American economic pie in 1960 to nearly 20% today, to the free and more competitive IT sector, where even the poorest of Americans can afford amazing technology. In the regulated, paralyzed healthcare sector, what a person must learn in order to legally offer medical advice via the licensing of doctors, where he must learn via the licensing of medical schools, what chemical compounds can be legally consumed, how to test drugs, how the medical insurance industry should work, and countless other gigantic bodies of knowledge and information are dictated by monopolistic, competitionless bureaucracies like the American Medical Association, the Food and Drug Administration, and numerous others. By comparison, the information technology sector has very few government regulations, so competition moves the creation and spread of superior information at breakneck speed, and is obviously transforming our world right before our eyes. Teenagers can work at Google, Microsoft, Amazon, and write the software that keeps planes in the sky or people alive via software and medical equipment. Yet there is no American Association of Computer Programmers dictating what or where such knowledge can be obtained, similar to how the government via the American Medical Association regulates, monopolizes, paralyzes the medical sector via the licensing of doctors, medical schools, insurance sector, etc. There is no government monopolistic bureaucracy ensuring the proper functioning of the software that runs PCs, smartphones, the internet, or ensuring the lack of malware or viruses in software. Freedom and competition in the software development industry is even quickly evolving our culture. It is increasingly seen as uncool and backward to have a traditional degree, where one wastes thousands of dollars and time physically attending gigantic temple-like universities inefficiently, professors instead of popular online videos you can pause and rewind, learning things that have nothing, like English 101, various history courses that are forced on you, learning things that have nothing to do with being a productive software, web, or IT professional. Thanks to this lack of monopolistic centralized decision-making, regulating, paralyzing, education in the software development and IT world is astounding. At places like www.freecodecamp.org, thousands of people are going from zero experience to highly paid computer programmers in just a few months for free. IT companies who reach a large enough size ultimately due to the great services they already provide, and therefore the useful and profitable knowledge that they contain, like Microsoft, Google, Amazon, and many others, go about creating their own competing educational institutions which train and test people using their products and technologies which are solving real problems and have been shaped by years of fierce competition and innovation. There are over 2.1 million individuals worldwide who have become Microsoft certified professionals by studying for and passing exams created by Microsoft. These exams change frequently to reflect the never-ending cycle of knowledge generation that exists in this freer and less regulated sector of the economy. Economic ignorance leads many to believe that since one has to be seemingly more careful with medicine, such monopolistic regulatory is somehow necessary. This is irrelevant. If it is superior information that is needed, which includes figuring out how careful to be, freedom and competition is the best way to discover it, period. My guess is that if the healthcare sector, or better yet, the entire worldwide economy, was as deregulated, free, competitive as the software and IT sector, in a few months the cost of healthcare would drop by at least 80%, the rate of innovation and prosperity would skyrocket, and I would guess that people who as of today have 10 years left to live might be able to be dying of old age. Only the truly economically woke can easily accept the feasibility of this last statement. But human flight is obviously impossible, as we all know. In this image, we can easily see how the less regulated a sector is, the smoother competitive knowledge discovery functions. Thus, the quicker cost-cutting ideas and innovations spread, leading to continuously lower prices and better products in things like electronics and software, but higher prices and in the more regulated paralyzed sectors like healthcare and hospitals. One of the numerous flaws in how the American Medical Association goes about regulating the world of medicine is in the assumption that medical professionals have to be some of the brightest and most dedicated people around, which it attempts to achieve by making entry into medical school and training such an arduous and ultimately expensive process. But this assumption is false. What cures people or produces any product or service in today's world is not so much hardworking, bright individuals. It is the tremendous amount of knowledge and cheap technology that the market process coordinated world puts at our fingertips. This flaw is not specific to the AMA. It applies to our educational establishments and much of how we look at learning and the role of human intelligence. The market process and resulting worldwide division of labor and information is far, far more important than individual intelligence, IQ, or effort. For example, Mike knows that he can incorporate Tom, who has Down syndrome and therefore a relatively lower IQ than the average person, into his landscaping company by having him perform simple tasks in a manner that increases the company's rate of production or revenue in terms of landscaping services by an additional $4 per hour or $640 per month. Mike trades $3 per hour or $480 per month for Tom's labor so that he can make a $1 per hour or $160 per month profit. And after just 10 hours of labor, production, and trade, Tom, who has a low IQ, can produce a mind-bogglingly complex tablet by trading his $30 for it. Thus, it currently takes about 10 hours of labor for a low IQ person to produce something that was impossible to create just 20 years ago. But he didn't really create the tablet, thinks the economically ignorant. But guess what? The economically woke knows that neither did the company that manufactured it. Did such a company create the tablet CPU, or the memory, camera, touchscreen, battery, plastic, or any of the machinery or tools required to produce the aforementioned components? Of course not. The manufacturer, just like Tom, mostly traded and added a relatively minuscule amount of new information compared to what it already got from the social organism and its worldwide division of labor and information that has been evolving for thousands of years. Due to massive economic ignorance, Tom's truly astounding rate of production is impossible to achieve. because it is either illegal for someone to trade their labor production for a rate lower than the minimum, $12 per hour in California, or because the legal expenses related to paying someone less than the minimum make it unprofitable to do so. Minimum wage laws are regulations which essentially outlaw all production that does not occur faster than the legally mandated minimum and hurt the least productive members of society who need the wealth the most. The elderly, who due to old age eventually produce at a slower rate, teenagers, etc. Government regulations, which again are inferior competition-less information which is imposed on the social order by force, not only paralyze the superior competitive knowledge discovery that would otherwise exist and enable the growth of paralyzing, inefficient bureaucracies, they also allow bad ideas to be much harder to change. We only have to remind ourselves of the Catholic Church's regulation of speech and thought, which led to the persecution of thinkers like Galileo, and thus the general retardation of scientific progress to various degrees. Bad ideas, like socialism and communism, must have intellectual persecution in order to prevent criticism or ideological competition. So once again, we must highlight that freedom is not only indispensable for the competitive discovery of innovations, but also for discovering the truth. Thus, we can see that freedom is the ultimate algorithm. It discovers the information that orders civilization, it civilizes our morals, is also indispensable for discovering the truth, and is the very opposite of coercion and tyranny. Patents. By understanding how patents do far more harm than good, we can continue to solidify our vital understanding of how information coordinates the social order. One of the reasons why we so naively fall for the erroneous idea that patents are good for society is because we greatly overestimate the importance of the individual or company making the discovery while being unaware of how it is the market process, via its various mechanisms like prices, the profit motive, and competition, which plays the key role in innovation. Competing orders or companies, due to the fact that they are already in business competing with each other, contain knowledge that has to be relatively similar. If one competitor has knowledge that leads to much more productivity, profitability, it would drive some competitors out of business, and it would also motivate competitors to copy, emulate the superior knowledge, thus leading to a state where once again all competitors contain more or less the same knowledge and inevitably come up with new products, improvements, innovations. Which particular mind manages to stumble upon a new innovation has more to do with chance and circumstance than anything else. Patents inevitably turn competitors, which are ultimately cooperators, since we are constantly learning from each other as we compete, into bitter rivals. Give credit to one where many, or better said, the entire social order via the market process and worldwide division of labor are involved. They slow down the market process by preventing further innovation by competitors whose ideas are based on patented ideas because they now have to pay large sums to the patent holders. They remove competitive pressure from patent holders, thus making them lazier and worth their time and money to go into the damaging business of suing patent infringers, thus retarding progress. And since the patent system is overseen by a monopolistic and bureaucratic government organization, it is bound to grow more inefficient and chaotic and also prone to manipulation by the better connected. Patents, just like regulations, simply create spread paralysis in the market process. The information technology industry provides a good example of how patents begin to paralyze an industry. Prior to 1981, computer programs could not be patented, and this helped spark the explosive growth in the computer and software industry. As Microsoft founder Bill Gates tells us, quote, "If people had understood how patents would be granted when most of today's ideas were invented, and had taken out patents, the industry would be at a complete standstill today. I feel certain that some large company will patent some obvious thing. If we assume this company has no need of any of our patents, then they have a 17-year right to take as much of our profits as they want. The solution to this is patent exchanges with large companies and patenting as much as we can." End quote. So Gates clearly saw how patents would lead to paralysis. Unfortunately, his solution at the time was not to argue for the abolishment of patents altogether, which I don't blame him for, but to attempt to protect his company by patenting as many things as possible with which to threaten, protect itself from others in this new ecosystem of warring, litigating patent holders. Given the incentives, this is the strategy that works or is naturally selected. Thus, we have bigger and bigger patent holders fighting it out with others in order to progress, while at the same time making it harder and harder for the little guy or new competitor to innovate. Without patents, the social order is constantly improving and moving the best information which can be copied freely and quickly. But existing patents inadvertently disincentivize this more ideal outcome and cause research and wealth to be diverted for the discovery of non-patented inferior information. For example, a whopping 77% of new drugs approved by the FDA are not new in the sense that they make some significant improvement compared to an existing drug. They are what are referred to as Me Too drugs. These Me Too drugs are usually inferior to drugs already in the market to treat the same condition. They simply allow competing drug manufacturers to enter the market to treat a condition where other companies might be making huge profits due to their patent monopolistic position. Innovating is a lot easier than people think. As previously mentioned, as prices or costs of production go down, that which was prohibitively expensive becomes possible, which in turn makes other things possible, and so on. The world is vastly more innovative today than it was 100 years ago, not because we got any smarter, because obviously our biology has not changed, but because the market process has made it easier to innovate. Some innovations revolutionize entire fields and make it easy for further innovations to come about. For example, how much easier was it for scientists to make biology-related innovations once the electron microscope took magnification from 2,000 times to over 2 million? How much easier was it to invent all sorts of gadgets once electricity came about, or computers, or the internet? The market process and continuously evolving worldwide division of labor can be seen as a sort of ever-growing ladder, taking humanity up an infinitely high tree whose fruits are the innovations. For the most part, all we have to do is easily pick them off the branches when the ladder gets us there. Very expensive endeavors that only seem profitable if granted patents can be seen as attempts to grab a fruit or innovation that is currently too high up in the tree, and we are better off just waiting for the normal technological progress to get us there by cheapening all related research, etc. Instead of damaging the workings of the system, the ladder, in an attempt to make gains that really leave us worse off due to the damage made to the ladder, the system, by patents. The damaging pro-patent ideology is also adding tensions between patent enforcing nations and developing nations who are being coerced or erroneously persuaded to implement patents, while also being sort of accused of quote-unquote stealing our ideas without proper compensation, end quote. This is rooted in the same fallacy of attributing innovation to those making the innovation as opposed to the market process. So-called developed areas like North America, Europe, and Japan became developed because the market process managed to work well enough in those areas as to incentivize and coordinate minds in a way that so much knowledge was created. And this was done in spite of patents, not because of them. Old people being more likely to be found with cancers does not mean that having cancers leads to old age. It means that natural selection has built us in a way that we can continue to live for a while in spite of the cancers. Too much government, just like too much cancer, eventually destroys the superstructure. The market process ability to organize the social order in ways that lead to what we call progress is amazing. A little freedom goes a long way. Technological progress in the 20th century has been great in spite of cancerous government bureaucracies, wars, patents, and other misguided government regulatory frameworks, which we believe to be the creators or managers of the social order, while they are in fact its retardants or destroyers to significant degrees. Think about how truly unfair the following is. The Chinese had the misfortune of having much of their 20th century destroyed by war and a truly communist economy, which led to the deaths of tens of millions, while the market process used millions of brains in the US to discover new ideas. And now that the Chinese increase their freedom and begin to have their social order be coordinated by the market process, they have to pay royalties to the West. This seems pretty unfair to me. Developing nations like India and China should not feel like they are stealing ideas from the more advanced and developed nations. And likewise, the United States should not be souring economic relations based on patent infringement, which you can be sure is a significant part of the economic saber rattling that the economically clueless tribalistic Trump administration is doing. The free migration of people allows them to quickly become parts of and expand the most productive orders, thus vastly increasing production. A person in Africa is stuck in an unproductive order which lacks good laws, respect for private property of course, roads, advanced tools and factories, large groups of already highly educated and productive minds and order, so his production might be $5 per day. By just moving to a more advanced and productive country or area like the US, even without knowing English, he can do many jobs managed and aided by a bilingual English speaker and easily increase his rate of production to say $7 per hour or $56 per day, an 11-fold increase in his rate of production, benefiting his life tremendously and that of existing American and world producers because they now have additional customers that can actually afford their products instead of poor Africans that can't. In countries like China, every day thousands of relatively unproductive farmers who are producing wealth at a rate of say $4 per day are moving to cities to join, work with, use factories which might triple their rate of production to say $12 per day. Similarly, one of the reasons why the US has been far more productive than the similarly sized Europe is because people have had the freedom to easily move to the areas or companies that are more productive, and there have been no internal tariffs and other impediments to free trade. When countries allow foreign investment, they make it profitable for wealth to be shipped to poor countries to create the tools, factories, order that can increase the productivity of workers. But it is even better when the workers have the freedom to quickly move to and incorporate themselves with the already existing, more productive orders. Finance, banking, and interest rates are other vital aspects of the market process. Besides the more obvious function of safeguarding savings and pooling the savings of many people to allow the execution of bigger projects, which would have been impossible if entrepreneurs were limited to the few savings and wealth of friends and family, banking, finance, and more specifically the phenomenon of interest rates also play a nearly miraculous role. For example, assuming interest rates are around 5%, some people, those who have no desire to start a business or have inferior business ideas they expect will have a return on investment lower than 5%, will be motivated to lend their money to banks to earn the 5% interest. And by doing so, they refrain from consumption and spending, thus increasing the amount of wealth and savings available for future borrowers to then consume. Something amazing is going on here. Interest rates motivate the accumulation of wealth and movement of money from minds that have inferior ideas that can grow the economic pie slowly from 0 to 5%, to minds that have superior ideas and can grow the economy faster than 5%, thus giving a tremendous sort of computational boost to society. To the economically ignorant, bankers, financiers, and moneylenders, making a living by charging interest without seemingly having to sweat seems immoral or unethical. But the economically woke can see how they play a vital role in pairing saved wealth with the best ideas, and the interest rate is like a barometer that helps decide whether a mind should do the saving or the borrowing. It is important to realize that, as the great economist Henry Hazlitt writes in his classic Economics in One Lesson, quote, saving, in short, in the modern world, is only another form of spending. The usual difference is that the money is turned over to someone else to spend on means to increase production, end quote. And that this increase in production has to be at least large enough to pay back the loan with interest. The economically ignorant masses are unaware of the fact that thanks to the finance and banking sector, the savings of the much vilified rich is the very wealth that private sector workers consume while they go about increasing production by an amount greater than the current interest rate. Taxing the rich just removes this wealth and the private sector jobs it would otherwise sustain and gives it to government where it is inefficiently consumed while producing little in comparison, leading to massive relative losses. Taxes, besides being an obvious burden on taxpayers, simply destroy private sector jobs. A society that saves little is sort of stuck in the same cycle of production and consumption and is unable to nourish a new business idea or restructuring of society for the time it might take before it can produce wealth. Where would our 10,000 airplane factory workers get the wealth to nourish their consumption for 2 years it would take for them to even begin making new planes if others had not saved it? How long would it take for such savings and wealth to exist if savings grow very slowly? On the other hand, a society that saves a lot is constantly making wealth available for superior ideas, businesses, restructurings, and thus growing and advancing technologically much, much faster. The so-called business cycles, where the economy goes from boom to bust, is simply due to the seemingly obvious fact that governments, via their central banks, creating money which is then given to businesses, does not create the real wealth businesses need to consume while they go about production. For example, again, our airplane factory workers must consume or use the concrete materials, food, energy, transportation, shelter that they, as well as their dependents and family, need while they go about producing the factory. If the needed real wealth or the means and wealth to create it already exists because it had been previously produced and then remains unconsumed and thus saved, good. There is a chance that they end up producing more than they consumed, thus being profitable and therefore increasing the economic pie. But if instead of real wealth and savings, governments, banks simply increase the amount of money while no corresponding increase in real wealth and savings exists, all it is doing is increasing the amount of money per unit of wealth, thus higher prices than would have otherwise been the case, which eventually causes many entrepreneurs to face the obvious fact that there did not exist enough wealth at the right prices to complete their projects in a profitable way. Therefore, a sort of bust and chaos and massive loss of wealth will eventually happen as inevitable bankruptcies occur. Sustaining the men's consumption for a year to create some partly finished buildings and machines, and then having to abandon the project because prices have increased in a manner that no longer makes the project profitable, leads to zero planes wealth for a massive net loss of wealth. Even easier, imagine two wealthy couples, each with a child, who both want to go out on the same night, a project. But there is only one babysitter, savings, wealth. No amount of money will allow both to execute their plans. What they need is more savings, wealth, babysitters. Bottom line, governments via their central banks and money creation can't help the economy and are the source of disastrous business boom and bust cycles. We quote the great economist Ludwig von Mises. Quote, however conditions may be, it is certain that no manipulations of the banks can provide the economic system with the capital goods. What is needed for a sound expansion of production is additional capital goods, not money. The boom is built on the sands of banknotes and deposits. It must collapse. We have reached the end of our purely economic discussion. Again, try to envision the 8 billion brains, each using profit-loss calculation to discover the most productive way to order its private property or section of the social order, creating and spreading superior information and subsequent order thanks to global free trade and the resulting competitive knowledge discovery. Envision more production than consumption, leading to saved and thus accumulated wealth, which thanks to interest rates and the banking and finance industry is then put under the control of minds that lead to even faster rate of production and transformation of the socioeconomic order. Generally speaking, the slightly smarter apes and their mainstream leaders and experts have little idea how the socioeconomic order works. They went from believing that prosperity arose from doing the will of the gods to then believing in the central plans of the quote-unquote great leaders and their experts via the full-blown socialism and communism of the Soviet Union and China, and now find themselves increasingly believing, once again, in the experts, this time the central bankers at the Federal Reserve and so on, and their mythical mathematical models. Just like Alan came to be seen by the economically ignorant inhabitants of Blue Isle as the great order maker, so has mankind fooled itself into believing that the central bankers, not freedom or the market process, are the great order makers. Amazingly, The market process and resulting civilization or social organism is to a significant degree the emergent behavior of a single concept or tradition, private property, and the freedom and competitive knowledge discovery and order that emerges from it. How wonderful and somewhat counterintuitive it is that the more freedom we have, the more we get to live our lives as we wish, but also maximize our contribution to the global supercomputer or social organism we are inadvertently becoming parts of. Unfortunately, the average slightly smarter ape has no idea how the social organism works, or much less how it has evolved. Why? Because just like natural selection evolved the numerous mechanisms that turn solitary cells into complex multicellular organisms, so has natural selection, not human reason or great leaders or thinkers, created the market process. How this happened is what we briefly discuss next. Having discussed several aspects of the market process like economic competition and interest rates, as well as how private property inadvertently leads to its emergence and civilization, we can now discuss how processes of selective evolution evolve the market process or social organism without conscious human planning or design. As the great Karl Menger asks, quote, "How can it be that institutions that serve the common welfare and are extremely significant for its development come into being without a common will directed towards establishing them?" End quote. Again, how is it that in just a few thousand years, dangerous, slightly smarter apes evolved this incredible sort of economic matrix we are parts of without anyone really planning it? Not only was the market process and resulting commercial society not designed by people, most people hate it and want central planning by experts and thus its complete destruction. Again, how did civilization arise without human design? Hayek answered this monumentally important question more or less as follows. If we envision mankind about 50,000 years ago, we would see a sort of petri dish of competing cultures, languages, concepts, rules, laws that are being naturally selected based on their ability to grow the groups that contain them relative to other groups. Customs, concepts, rules, etc., that inadvertently cause their respective social orders to grow, whether it be via conquest, successful defense, migration into, imitation, etc., will expand their order and the very customs, concepts, rules, ideologies, etc., which help them thrive. Every rule or law has an effect in the productivity, growth, survival of the social order. Given that a society or a tribe is likely to have dozens of such rules, it is impossible to know exactly the impact of any one of them when considering the overall competitiveness of a society or order. For simplicity's sake, let us focus on just one rule. What is the optimal punishment for theft? Let's assume that in culture or tribe A, when a man steals, he is killed, which might deter many thefts but decreases the number of people in the group and all the productivity that this person might contribute in the future. In tribe B, they cut off a hand, and in tribe C, they give 10 lashes. Let's assume that tribe A's custom rule of killing the thief actually proved to lead to a fitter social order. Perhaps it turns out that cutting off the hand led to an unproductive person that became a big drain on the rest of the tribe and a weak, useless fighter when it came to offense or defense, so it was better if he was dead. And that lashes proved to not be enough of a detriment, which led to many thefts and retaliatory violence, which turned out to be more costly than losing a member of the tribe. For simplicity's sake, let us assume that this was by far the most important custom or rule affecting the growth or fitness of the social order, and that because of this, tribe, culture A, eventually displaced the others so that its kill thieves rule or custom survived while the other punishments disappeared. The kill thieves rule is the result of an action, yet not the result of conscious planning or designing with the reasoned or conscious goal of having a more competitive or fit social order. The real designing of this rule or cultural element was made not by innate instinct or human reason, but by natural selection, by competition, by group selection, by cultural evolution. This concept of cultural or group selection allowed Hayek to identify a sort of third dimension or source or mechanism for discovering and spreading knowledge which was neither instinctual, tied to our genetics or biology, nor the result of our conscious reason. As Hayek liked to refer to it, it was a mechanism for creating and spreading information which laid, quote unquote, between instinct and reason, and is the largely unknown or understood source of knowledge that played the vital role in the evolution of the market process and those related social institutions. Omnipresence, the ability to be everywhere at all times, is another concept that would provide a great benefit to the religions that used it to describe their God. Without God's omnipresence, you could get away with breaking the rules that give society order and only have to face the consequences brought upon by fellow men. But if God is everywhere, watching your every move, you will be much more likely to follow those rules that give your society a productive social order. A similar case can be made for the concepts of sin and evil. Did clever men conspire to create our religions to control us? Of course not. Like the market process, they too are indeed the result of human action, but not the execution of any human design. These concepts or rules help enforce constraints on what for brevity's sake we'll refer to as our evolved tribalistic, primate-like nature and instincts, which for millions of years were shaped by things like cannibalism, rape, tribal warfare, and other practices which are now generally seen as abhorrent and whose relatively recent suppression via culture, religion, law enabled the emergence of the social organism and civilization. Growing up is about programming, molding our flexible brains into learning all of these rules, and thus rewiring them to be as happy as possible, even though many of these restrictions go counter to our uncivilized instincts. We have tentacle porn. What else needs to be said? Obviously, the molding, brainwashing fails quite often when we engage in rape, torture, militarism, war, etc. One can easily speculate about how the simplicity and pro-private property character of Judaism's 10 Commandments, thou shalt not steal, murder, commit adultery, covet thy neighbor's wife, and its monotheism helped it be more viral and thus be naturally selected over other beliefs or religions that might have been more complex, confusing, contradictory, and also be less respectful of private property, thus inadvertently foregoing the emergence of the market process and corresponding civilization. Just like natural selection modified solitary cells to have tumor-suppressing genes to control rapid cell division and proliferation, which is what we call cancer, in order to cooperate in a multicellular organism, so has cultural evolution likewise molded Homo sapiens to suppress these uncivilized, animalistic, barbaric tendencies. As Hayek tells us, man has been civilized very much against his wishes. It was the price he had to pay for being able to raise a larger number of children. We especially dislike the economic disciplines. The indispensable rules of the free society require much from us that is unpleasant, such as suffering competition from others, seeing others be richer than ourselves, etc., etc. End quote. Knowing that private property is the simple concept or institution that leads to a chain reaction of incentives which creates the social organism, we can easily see that those tribes or orders whose customs, religions inadvertently became more peaceful and thus less violent, extended peace, friendship, trade to those outside the tribe, etc. In other words, those who tended to respect private property and thus individual freedom more and more would become more advanced and powerful, and as they grew, they would inadvertently spread the very customs that allow them to reach such relative heights. Once again, the true sort of designer of the market process was our old friend, natural selection, competition, acting on groups and cultures, inadvertently selecting those customs, ideologies, concepts as if they were genes. We are now in a position to understand Hayek when he writes, quote, "The ultimate decision about what is accepted as right and wrong will be made not by individual human wisdom, but by the disappearance of the groups that have adhered to the wrong beliefs." End quote. And another quote, "Culture is neither natural nor artificial, neither genetically transmitted nor rationally designed. It is a tradition of learned rules, of conduct which have never been invented and whose functions the acting individuals usually do not understand." End quote. We must stress the fact that the cultural evolutionary process, which has created the market process and thus civilization, is much, much faster than the slow genetic biological evolution, thus rendering slight genetic differences between races, populations largely irrelevant, as Hayek tells us. Quote, "With respect to what we mean by cultural evolution in a narrower sense, that is, the fast and accelerating development of civilization, since it differs from genetic evolution by relying on the transmission of acquired properties, it is very fast, and once it dominates, it swamps genetic evolution." End quote. Also, begin quote, "Biological evolution would have been far too slow to alter or replace man's innate responses in the course of the 10 or 20,000 years during which civilization has developed. Thus, it hardly seems possible that civilization and culture are genetically determined and transmitted. They have to be learned by all alike through tradition." End quote. As numerous great free market thinkers like Mises, Robert Hicks, and Ralph Raico, just to name a few, have shown, during the last couple thousand years, different groups of people in widely dispersed locations like the Middle East, Asia, and Europe traded the sort of title for the most socioeconomic advanced places in the planet. With respect to the momentary lead in terms of civilization that China had, and the real reason why whites, Europeans, had a recent relative lead, Hayek writes, begin quote, "The history of China provides many instances of government attempts to enforce so perfect an order that innovation became impossible. This country, technologically and scientifically developed so far ahead of Europe that, to give only one illustration, it had 10 oil wells operating on one stretch of the River Po already in the 12th century, certainly owed its latter stagnation, but not its early progress, to the manipulatory power of its governments. What led the greatly advanced civilization of China to fall behind Europe was its governments clamping down so tightly as to leave no room for new developments, while Europe probably owes its extraordinary expansion in the Middle Ages to its political anarchy." End quote. Essentially, the Chinese government of the 12th century prevented cultural evolution from evolving superior and more business-friendly customs, while Europe, with its decentralized and thus competitive kingdoms, was able to do so and build a significant lead. However, it is easy to see that, at least compared to its recent past, from the 1980s, it is China that has been moving more towards free trade and capitalism, while the US heads in the other direction. The political anarchy Hayek referred to in the earlier quote just means that there was no central authority preventing, monopolizing legal, religious, moral, ethical knowledge, and thus preventing the superior knowledge discovery that cultural evolution and competition brings about. Not only does government stamp out competition, which is the main selective or competitive process that helps us discover what is the best in terms of how to go about providing goods and services, but also what rules, laws, judicial, penal, transportation systems, and more are best. Since freedom, decentralization, and the economic, legal, moral competition it creates is the best way to discover superior information and subsequent order, why not allow freedom and competition in things we usually associate with monopolistic governments like the legal and penal systems and more? The cultural, evolutionary, competitive process that has shaped religions and more recently secular governments which provide such governmental functions has been happening blindly and has been largely tied to the religious myths we inevitably see as absolutes, which explains why the legal and penal systems are still draped in religious-like mysticism. Think of priestly judges and their customs and robes, temple-like court buildings, etc. But once we understand the competitive process, we can use it to our advantage. Imagine if people could own large chunks of land and have more sovereignty or freedom as to what laws, rules people should abide by in them. Today, the knowledge of how to plan a city, what laws, rules we should follow, what should be the repercussions of breaking such rules or laws, how to design a transportation, legal, penal system, and so much more, comes about the bureaucratic, monopolized, politicized process that shapes the inefficient public sector. By allowing people the freedom to create such cities, we introduce competition in these areas, which will discover superior laws, rules, contracts, ways to build transportation systems, ways to deal with the people who break the rules, and so on. If people wanted to move to such cities, they would just sign a contract saying that they would abide by its rules, which is no different than what we do today when we move to a new country or state, which is just agreeing to abide by certain rules. This is similar to choosing product A over product B. In this case, people are selecting one set of rules, laws, over the other, nourishing a better social order, information, while starving an inferior one. They vote for a better system with their feet. We are done with the more theoretical aspects of this video. We discussed how the market process and its various components like money, prices, economic competition, and interest rates create the socioeconomic order, and also discussed how cultural evolution, in other words, competition among groups and their religions, rules, ideologies, is what played the leading role in the creation and evolution of the market process and resulting civilization. This process kept updating the software or culture that brainwashed dangerous, slightly smarter, intuitively communist tribal apes into respecting private property and thus individual freedom more and more. Again, the process was more the result of cultural evolution and natural selection than our reason. Had human reason been the designer of such a wonderful matrix we are parts of, its workings would have already been clearly described in our religious texts, etc. But obviously this is not the case. Hardly anyone in the planet has the slightest clue how respect for private property and resulting competitive knowledge discovery, as opposed to central planning by experts, is the key to order and harmony as opposed to chaos, social injustice, and exploitation, etc. Hayek summarizes, quote, "We have never designed our economic system. We were not intelligent enough for that. We have stumbled into it, and it has carried us to unforeseen heights and given rise to ambitions which may yet lead us to destroy it." End quote. With respect to private property, Hayek writes, quote, "I am quite convinced nobody invented it for a known purpose, and to me the proof of this is that even now hardly anybody yet understands what the advantages of private property and the market society are." End quote. We now apply such wisdom to our most pressing problems. War is the absolute worst thing for the economy and mankind. Millions of people, previously employed or not, joined the war effort by either killing fellow human beings and destroying wealth or working to create armaments, etc., thus increasing the economic pie by little in terms of civilian goods, and while they do so, they must consume food, energy, etc., real useful stuff, thus leading to an obvious overall shrinking of the economic pie in terms of useful civilian goods. They are all working, of course, but ultimately they are not ordered in a way that truly grows the economic pie with the wealth that makes life worth living and can be further consumed while producing more things. If military spending and full employment, thanks to it, were a good thing, then the militaristic Soviet Union and North Korea would have flourished. Mainstream Keynesian economists like Paul Krugman and proponents of modern monetary theory are totally clueless. John Maynard Keynes writes, quote, "Activity of one kind or another is the only possible means of making the wheels of economic progress and of the production of wealth go round again." End quote. Wrong. The activity must be coordinated in a manner that leads to more production than consumption, something only free individuals in the private sector could accomplish. Otherwise, you are obviously destroying the social order, which is precisely what war does. But the clueless mainstream economists, like 2008 Nobel Laureate in Economics Paul Krugman and the modern monetary theory proponents, do not understand this vital fact. So the erroneous belief that real savings wealth, that business must consume while they produce, can be created by central banks by just creating more money to then, quote-unquote, stimulate the economy, activity of one kind or another, even if you have zero regard for whether the people are ordered in a way that produces more than it consumes. These two fallacies provide the 1-2 punch of fallacies that keep the mainstream making the same errors over and over, culminating in the most horrific economic fallacy that could possibly exist. Once again, that war is good for the economy, and its corollary, that World War II is what got the United States out of the Great Depression in the 1930s. The following clip by Krugman and CNN news anchor Fareed Zakaria beautifully captures the fallacies of Keynesian economics, Krugman, and the mainstream media.
But even if you were, wouldn't John Maynard Keynes say that if you could employ people to dig a ditch and then fill it up again, that's fine. They're being productively employed. They pay taxes. So maybe Boston's big dig was just fine after all.
Think about World War II, right? That was actually negative for social product spending, and yet it brought us out. I mean, partly because you want to put these things together. If we say, look, we could use some inflation, Ken and I are both saying that, which is, of course, anathema to a lot of people in Washington, but is in fact what the basic logic says. It's very hard to get inflation in a depressed economy, but if you had a program of government spending plus an expansionary policy by the Fed, you could get that. So if you think about using all of these things together, you could accomplish, a great deal. I mean, if we discovered that space aliens were planning to attack, and we needed a massive buildup to counter the space alien threat, and really inflation and budget deficits took secondary place to that, this slump would be over in 18 months.
How can getting millions of people to consume wear down existing wealth to produce weapons which are then used to destroy fellow human beings and their property be anything other than an obvious reduction in life, wealth, and order? Krugman's statement is the perfect example of what the great Ludwig von Mises once told students. Quote, "Don't be afraid to speak up. Remember, whatever you say about the subject, and however wrong it may be, the same thing has already been said by some eminent economist." We are now ready to understand how the same economic fallacies which led to the rise of communism and the Soviet Union are simply repeating themselves. It could be said that socialism, communism, is a complex of economic fallacies which was almost bound to happen as the social order morphed itself from the easy-to-understand small farm towns of the pre-1800s to the bewildering growing complexity of the social order brought about by industrialization, worldwide free trade, competition, and capitalism. Without an understanding of what has just been discussed, most intellectuals of the 1800s and 1900s, with the best of intentions, just believed that a far more prosperous and quote-unquote just world could be achieved by central planning. Albert Einstein is perhaps the perfect example of a genius who, with the best of intentions, would use his reason to provide what is essentially a recipe for the destruction of civilization via his economically ignorant push for central planning and socialism. In his 1949 article titled "Why Socialism?" he writes, quote, "Technological progress frequently results in more unemployment rather than in an easing of the burden of work for all. The profit motive, in conjunction with competition among capitalists, is responsible for an instability in the accumulation and utilization of capital, which leads to increasingly severe depressions. Unlimited competition leads to a huge waste of labor, and to that crippling of the social consciousness of individuals which I mentioned before." End quote. Technological progress allows us to lower costs so more wealth can be created while consuming less, thus growing the economic pie. Technological progress has made it so that on average a single worker in the agricultural sector, thanks to increasingly automated tractors and machinery, can create vast quantities of food, and competition between such farmers guarantees that they must innovate and copy each other's innovations, and that they must sell their food cheaply and competitively, so now the masses have more wealth to spend in other sectors helping them grow, like the IT sector and everything else we now have, since we don't have 80% of people working on farms like we did just a few centuries ago. The wealth that no longer sustains a job that has been lost to automation simply goes to sustain some other job, allowing us to easily afford more stuff, the stuff that got automated, plus the new stuff we spend our money and wealth on. Quote-unquote accumulation and utilization of capital, thanks to finance, banking, and interest rates, pairs such wealth with the best ideas, maximizing economic growth and the wages of all workers, as the increasingly wealthier companies, investors, people, orders have to offer more wealth to workers as they compete for their labor. Instability and quote-unquote severe depressions are caused by government interferences in the market and the previously discussed business cycles brought about when banks create money to encourage business expansion, when what businesses really need is previously saved and thus unconsumed wealth, obviously not more money. Einstein continues, quote, This crippling of individuals I consider the worst evil of capitalism. Our whole educational system suffers from this evil. An exaggerated competitive attitude is inculcated into the student, who is trained to worship acquisitive success as a preparation for his future career. I am convinced there is only one way to eliminate these grave evils, namely through the establishment of a socialist economy, accompanied by an educational system which will be oriented towards social goals. In such an economy, the means of production are owned by society itself and are utilized in a planned fashion. A planned economy, which adjusts production to the needs of the community, would distribute the work to be done among all those able to work and would guarantee a livelihood to every man, woman, and child. End quote. What's wrong with having a competitive attitude that just motivates people to work harder, to copy the innovations of others, to be as productive as possible, growing the economic pie, leading to the faster movement of technology, more savings, more investment? Again, it is what accelerates progress. In a free society, resources are utilized in a planned fashion, in the highly efficient and competitive plans of millions of entrepreneurs who are constantly trying to outdo each other, trying to serve the quote-unquote needs of the community, and are in ways subservient to the desires of consumers, as Mises explains. Quote, the consumers, by their buying or abstention from buying, ultimately determined what should be produced and in what quantity and quality. They render profitable the affairs of those businessmen who best comply with their wishes, and unprofitable the affairs of those who do not produce what they are asking for most urgently. Profits convey control of the factors of production into the hands of those who are employing them for the best possible satisfaction of the most urgent needs of the consumers, and losses withdraw them from the control of the inefficient businessman. In a market economy not sabotaged by the government, the owners of property are mandataries of the consumers, as it were. On the market, a daily repeated plebiscite determines who should own what and how much. It is the consumers who make some people rich and other people penniless. End quote. So as painful as it might be to admit for some, if Einstein can be so utterly clueless, we can hardly blame Lenin, Mao, Stalin, Roosevelt, and the countless others for the economic suffering they caused. Socialism, communism, viral economic fallacies did not spread and destroy much of the 20th century because of a few bad apples or tyrants. They first spread through the minds of well-meaning citizens and intellectuals like Einstein, which then gave the future leaders the moral and intellectual justification for their actions. Friedrich Hayek writes, quote, it is necessary to realize that the sources of many of the most harmful agents in this world are often not evil men, but high-minded idealists, and that in particular the foundations of totalitarian barbarism have been laid by honorable and well-meaning scholars who never recognized the offspring they produced. End quote. Another Hayek quote. Most people are still unwilling to face the most alarming lesson of modern history, that the greatest crimes of our time have been committed by governments that had the enthusiastic support of millions of people who were guided by moral impulses. It is simply not true that Hitler or Mussolini, Lenin or Stalin appealed only to the worst instincts of their people. They also appealed to some of the feelings which also dominate contemporary democracies. End quote. It is monumentally important that we see communism, central planning, and Lenin's Bolshevik Revolution, which created the Soviet Union in 1922, as an almost inevitable spread of viral, self-reinforcing economic fallacies and incentives that were just bound to finally spark in a truly sustainable reaction. It wasn't just the economic fallacies, but a perverse incentive structure too. A young idealistic Russian could worry about how to make a good living in the always uncertain and competitive private sector, or by joining Lenin and his Bolsheviks, he could become a hero to mankind by just forcing the farmers to give up their grain to feed a bureaucracy of monopoly of experts who would plan a superior social order. Sign me up. Again, we must focus on how the ideas lead the slightly smarter apes into either carnage or civilization. We quote Mises again. It is ideas that group men into fighting factions, that press the weapons into their hands, and that determine against whom and for whom the weapons shall be used. It is they alone, not the arms, that, in the last analysis, turn the scales. End quote. Lenin was a great leader who had the strength to carry out his vision. An example of one of the orders he was sending to various cities districts to deal with the farmers, kulaks, who were rebelling against the grain requisitions went as follows. I quote Lenin, "Comrades, the kulak uprising in your 5 districts must be crushed without pity. The interest of the whole revolution demands such actions, for the final struggle with the kulaks has now begun. You must make an example of these people. 1. Hang, and I mean publicly, so that people see it, at least 100 kulaks, rich bastards, and known bloodsuckers. 2. Publish their names. 3. Seize all their grain. 4. Single out the hostages per my instructions in yesterday's telegram. Do all this so that for miles around people see it all, understand it, tremble, and tell themselves that we are killing the bloodthirsty kulaks and that we will continue to do so. Reply saying you have received and carried out these instructions. Yours, Lenin. P.S. Find tougher people." End quote. The unproductive chaos, tyranny that Lenin was creating inevitably brought a gigantic famine that would claim about 5 million lives in 1921 and 1922. The majestic Black Book of Communism, Crimes, Terror, and Repression explains, I quote the book, "Despite the bad harvest of 1920, all grain stocks, even the seed for the future harvest, had been seized. Numerous peasants had virtually nothing to eat since January 1921. The mortality rate had immediately increased in February. In the space of 2 to 3 months, riots and revolts against the regime had effectively stopped in the province of Samara. Today," Babilin explained, "there are no more revolts. We see new phenomena instead. Crowds of thousands of starving people gather around the executive committee or the party headquarters of the Soviet to wait for days and days for the miraculous appearance of the food they need. It is impossible to chase this crowd away. Every day more of them die. They are dropping like flies. I think there must be at least 900,000 starving people in this province." End quote. By Babilin. I continue the quote from the Black Book of Communism. "Though perfectly well informed of the inevitable consequences of the requisitioning policy, the government took no steps to combat these predicted effects. On 30th July 1921, while famine gripped growing numbers of regions, Lenin and Molotov sent a telegram to all leaders of the regional and provincial party committees asking them to, quote-unquote, bolster the mechanisms for food collection, set up the propaganda for the rural population, explaining the economic and political importance of the prompt payment of taxes, put at the disposal of the agencies for the collection of taxes in kind all the authority of the party, and allow them to use all the disciplinary measures that the state itself would use." End of the book's quotes. Fortunately, other Bolshevik leaders helped Lenin accept relief from international organizations like the Red Cross, the Quakers, and future U.S. President Herbert Hoover's American Relief Association, whose combined efforts fed a whopping 11 million people each day. Lenin's anti-market and anti-production and thus anti-life order government control measures were such a disaster that by 1921, Lenin himself scaled some of it back in what came to be called the NEP, the New Economic Policy. The NEP essentially reintroduced some levels of private property and enterprise, especially for the farmers and kulaks, which immediately led to a better functioning of the market process and substantial increases in food production, 40% increase for 1921 to 1922. Among the numerous things to learn from this and similar disasters is the fact that it is understandably difficult for ideologues like Lenin and his governmental structure to change their minds, since not only do they have to admit to error, but to also realize that they have caused unimaginable suffering. This is just the kind of stuff the slightly smarter apes don't do that often. The incentives are to look the other way or to place the blame elsewhere. Even though Lenin was becoming aware of the chaos he was causing, he understandably had incentives to look for other causes, like saboteurs, the rich, capitalist exploiters, the religious, the church, who did not want to relinquish the power of authority. It was his economic policies that were intensifying the misery, but he would just double down, further intensifying it. Even though plenty of people knew communism would bring about unimaginable suffering, the rate at which the economic fallacies and ignorance and perverse incentives appeal to the tribalistic, slightly smarter apes was much faster than the rate at which the proper arguments against it could spread. One could say that the definitive knockout blow that proved the impossibility of central planning did not even exist until Ludwig von Mises wrote his quote-unquote economic calculation in the Socialist Commonwealth in 1920, far away and in a foreign language. Without sound economic arguments, which were also brief enough to be somewhat viral, much of mankind was doomed. The religious traditions of looking at the world's problems as the result of good versus evil did not work with the atheistic socialist communists who, thanks to scientific progress, would discard religion-based moral arguments. In other words, mankind was stuck in what Mises referred to as the moral sphere. Mises writes, quote, "The rigid dogmatism peculiar to religious groups and to Marxism results only in irreconcilable conflict. It condemns beforehand all dissenters as evildoers. It calls into question their good faith. It asks them to surrender unconditionally. No social cooperation is possible where such an attitude prevails." End quote. Thus, the ideological battle between the atheist central planning by experts, viral fallacies, and inherited religious traditions continued, with religion, private property, and thus humanity suffering immensely. In the period between 1927 and 1940, the number of Orthodox churches in the Soviet Union fell from 29,584 to less than 500. The Soviet Union's anti-religious purges were equal opportunity. In 1917, there were over 20,000 Islamic mosques in the Soviet Union. By 1935, there will be less than 60. Thousands of priests would stick to their faith and quickly be shot. The atheistic nature of the Soviet Union obviously played a role in making it so much easier to discard human life and thus tremendously deadlier. In February 25, 1956, Stalin's successor, Nikita Khrushchev, shook the world by admitting that, quote-unquote, the Great Terror, a political witch hunt that Stalin carried out 1936 to 1938 and led to the execution of about 700,000 people, had been based on lies, exaggerations, etc. He had to wait until Stalin's death to admit this mistake. However, it was not until Mikhail Gorbachev in 1991 that enough doubt and dissent emerged within the political structure and public in the USSR to finally put an end to the more textbook communist socialist intellectual error and resulting perverse incentives and relative tyranny that ruled that area since 1918. But the challenge did not end there. How do you get millions of people who have spent generations looking at a single bureaucracy to manage the social order and at least keep them alive to abandon that order maker and trust freedom and competition, especially if you were a mid to senior bureaucrat with low productive skill, or if you are one of the thousands upon thousands of quote-unquote educated scientists whose technical and scientific knowledge was simply not conducive to creating the things that free people, instead of communist bureaucrats, wanted. Economic ignorance as the root of antisemitism and its disastrous repercussions. We quote Hayek, referring to men in general. He writes, "The market economy is largely incomprehensible, and its results seem to them irrational and immoral. They often see in it merely an arbitrary structure maintained by some sinister power." End quote. Who is that sinister power? Each group of slightly smarter apes, depending on their history and numerous circumstances, mistakenly identifies a different boogeyman. As just briefly mentioned, since the recent and rapid evolution of the market process occurred in Europe, understandably so for much of the Third World and non-whites, it is the white man and his exploitative capitalism and or racism, etc. There is, of course, the evil corporations, the rich CEOs, greed, sexism, minorities, immigrants, etc. It is as if we are fooled into believing that just because the social order is the result of human action, that our problems are likewise the result of conscious planning or designing or plotting by fellow slightly smarter apes. They are not. They are overwhelmingly the result of economic ignorance. Next, we deal with one group of people where once again economic ignorance leads to their being mistaken as some sinister power, with disastrous worldwide consequences: the Jews. Let us begin our discussion by trying to identify the key economic fallacies which led to antisemitism and how these and other related fallacies led to Hitler's intellectual errors and much that is related. The classic and perhaps most important example of the coevolution of the market process and culture can be seen with the emergence of modern banking and finance. For example, Islam has strong prohibitions against charging interest, usury, which have short-circuited or greatly hampered the market process evolution in the Islamic world. The following passages from the Quran are perhaps the most relevant. Quote, that they took usury, though they were forbidden, and that they devoured men's substance wrongfully. We have prepared for those among them who reject faith a grievous punishment. End quote. Quote, those who devour usury will not stand except as stands one whom the evil one by his touch has driven to madness. That is because they say, trade is like usury, but Allah has permitted trade and forbidden usury. End quote. And again, Allah will deprive usury of all blessing, but will give increase for deeds of charity, for he does not love ungrateful and wicked creatures. End quote. Christianity's New Testament seems more usury-friendly via passages like Luke 19:23, quote, why then didst thou not put money in a bank, so that I, on my return, might have gotten it with interest, end quote. But Luke 6:35, quote, but love your enemies, do good to them, and lend to them without expecting to get anything back, end quote, could be used to support an anti-usury position, which is what the church enforced for over 1,000 years before eventually abandoning the strong anti-usury stand. When it comes to Judaism and the Old Testament, God's message is one that shuns charging interest between Israelites, Jews, but allows it to be charged to non-Israelites. The most influential verses are Deuteronomy 23:20, quote, you may charge a foreigner interest, but not a brother Israelite, end quote. And Exodus 22:25, quote, if you lend money to one of my people among you who is needy, do not be like a moneylender. Charge him no interest, end quote. This is a good example of mankind's tribal ethnocentrism, shunning a practice which is believed to be bad within the group, but allowing its use with those outside of the group. The 14th century French Jew Levi ben Gershom felt it was good to burden the Gentile with interest, quote, because one should not benefit an idolater and cause him as much damage without deviating from righteousness. The few religious scriptures we have just read have had profound ramifications. In a Christian world that would excommunicate usurers, moneylenders, Jews, being immune to excommunication, found an advantage as moneylenders, although an advantage that would also come with risky court battles, as Christian creditors would sometimes try to play the charging interest against God card when it came to paying their debts. The prevalence of Jews as moneylenders even shows itself in the Magna Carta, where there is a small section establishing some rules when dealing with Jewish moneylenders. Historian Paul Johnson writes, quote, the Jews reacted by engaging in the one business where Christian laws actually discriminated in their favor, and so became identified with the hated trade of moneylending. Rabbi Joseph Colon, who knew both France and Italy in the second half of the 15th century, wrote that the Jews of both countries hardly engaged in any other profession, end quote. Johnson mentions other ways in which Jews helped push the world in a more capitalist direction. One was financial innovation via their influence in the development of stock markets. Another was their stress on the importance of advertising. Better advertising speeds up competition and its rapid spread of superior ideas and products, so it is a great boost to civilization and order. Johnson also mentions how, quote, Jews were exceptionally adept at gathering and making use of commercial intelligence, end quote. For centuries, Jews evolved into a sort of extended family that covered much of the Western world. Quote, they ran sensitive and speedy information systems which enabled them to respond rapidly to political and military events and to the changing demands of regional, national, and world markets, end quote. The September 27, 1712 issue of England's Spectator described the Jews' influence as follows. Quote, They are so disseminated throughout all the trading parts of the world that they are become the instruments by which the most distant nations converse with one another and by which mankind are knit together in a general correspondence. They are like the pegs and nails in a great building, which, though they are but little valued in themselves, are absolutely necessary to keep the whole frame together." End quote. It was bad enough that they rejected the divinity of Christianity and Islam and practiced usury, but Jews were also fierce competitors who would upset Christian businessmen by disrupting their anti-competitive customs, all for the great benefit of the consumer and European social order and culture, of course. Historian economist Werner Sombart mentions how, according to the values at the time, quote, "to take away your neighbor's customer was contemptible, unchristian, and immoral." End quote. For example, in 1745 Toulouse, France, Christian traders would complain that, quote, "everybody runs to the Jewish traders." End quote. In Poland, 1619, quote, "difficulties and stumbling blocks put away merchants and craftsmen by the competition of Jews." End quote. In England, 17th century English merchant and one-time governor of the East India Company, Josiah Child, mentioned, quote, "the Jews are a subtle people, depriving the English merchant of that profit he would otherwise gain." End quote. In Prussia, 1750, quote, "the merchants of our town complain that Jewish traders who sell the same goods do them a great harm because they sell at a lower price." End quote. Mises writes, quote, "the Nazis have an ally in every town or village where there is a man eager to get rid of a Jewish competitor. The secret weapon of Hitler is the anti-Jewish inclinations of many millions of shopkeepers and grocers, of doctors and lawyers, professors and writers." End quote. Hitler, who like most popular leaders was simply the embodiment of the usual anti-capitalist economic fallacies, myths, prejudices of the times, was of course a National Socialist, who had little understanding of the vital role that economic competition plays in society and erroneously saw things like the emerging stock markets and finance industry, especially given the relative overrepresentation of Jews, as some gimmick or scam plotted by Jews to the detriment of non-Jews. His fallacies and ignorance can easily be seen in numerous excerpts, like this one from a speech given in Munich in July 28, 1922. Hitler mentions, "the vast process of the industrialization of the peoples meant the confluence of great masses of workmen in the towns. Parallel with this was a gradual monification of the whole of the nation's labor strength. Share capital was in the ascendant, and thus bit by bit the stock exchange came to control the whole national economy. The directors of these institutions were, and are without exception, Jews. I say without exception, for the few non-Jews who had a share in them are in the last resort nothing but screens, shop window Christians, whom one needs in order, for the sake of the masses, to keep up the appearance that these institutions were after all founded as a natural outcome of the needs and the economic life of all peoples alike, and were not, as was the fact, institutions which correspond only with the essential characteristics of the Jewish people and are the outcome of those characteristics." End quote. So Hitler does not see stock markets and modern finance as some quote-unquote natural outcome of the needs and the economic life of all peoples alike. He erroneously sees it more as something tied to the biology or characteristics or identity of Jews and to the detriment of non-Jews. Let us also briefly discuss some of the environmental, evolutionary factors or pressures which unfortunately attracted so many Jews to socialism and communism with disastrous repercussions. How prevalent were Jews in implementing socialist communist ideology? First of all, there was Karl Marx, socialism, communism's main intellectual, who gave the movement enough of a naive intellectual aura to mislead hundreds of future would-be tyrants, dictators, and intellectuals. Leon Trotsky, born Lev Davidovich Bronstein, founder of the Red Army, second only to Lenin, and most likely to succeed him as leader of the Russian communists, was also an ethnic Jew. Yuri Sklein writes, quote, "At the first All-Russian Congress of Soviets in June 1917, at least 31% of Bolshevik delegates and 37% of Unified Social Democrats were Jews. At the Bolshevik Central Committee meeting of October 23, 1917, which voted to launch an armed insurrection, 5 out of the 12 members present were Jews. 3 out of 7 Politburo members charged with leading the October uprising were Jews: Trotsky, Zinoviev, and Grigory Sokolonivov. End quote. According to Lenin, it was thanks to Jews that his Bolsheviks were able to, quote, take over the state apparatus, end quote, in Russia. Lenin mentions, quote, the fact that there were many Jewish intelligentsia members in the Russian cities was of great importance to the revolution. They put an end to the general sabotage that we were confronted with after the October Revolution. The Jewish elements were mobilized and thus saved the revolution at a difficult time. It was only thanks to this pull of a rational and literate labor force that we succeeded in taking over the state apparatus. End quote. For a people who were sometimes seen as foreigners, socialism's international brotherhood, workers of the world unite, was to be a popular rallying cry, would seem to have an additional appeal and be a perfect fit for a people who were already sort of an international family. Socialism's atheism would also do away with a major source of Jewish troubles now that everyone was supposed to be atheist, irreligious, in the new scientific and rational socialist world. The central and viral economic fallacy of socialism, that having smart people, experts, plan the social order would be better than letting selfish and greedy businessmen do so, needed the smarter and better educated to be the planners. And this is exactly what Jews were compared to the rest, at least in Russia, thus naturally rising to the top of the movement. Historian William Johnston writes that, quote, Jews had enjoyed many centuries of literacy before the rest of Europe started to become literate in the 18th century, end quote. Skline gives more detail. Quote, the Jews were, consistently and by a substantial margin, the most literate group in the Soviet Union, 85% as compared to 58% for Russians in 1926, and 94.3% as compared to 83.4% for Russians in 1939. By 1939, 26.5% of all Jews had a high school education, as compared to 7.8% of the population for the Soviet Union as a whole, and 8.1% for Russians in the Russian Federation. In Leningrad, the proportion of high school graduates among Jews was 40.2%, as compared to 28.6% for the city as a whole. The number of Jewish students in the 2 upper grades of Soviet high schools was more than 3 times their share in the general population. End quote. Chaim Weizmann recalls in his autobiography the simple fact that, quote, the non-Jewish population had not the same overwhelming thirst for knowledge as the Jews, who were always knocking at the doors of the schools. End quote. This large association of ethnic Jews with socialism would have disastrous consequences for the majority of Jews who did not want to be a part of socialism or much less abandon their faith and traditions. As Lenin and Trotsky were launching post-World War I Russia into a civil war, 1918 to 1922, between the Communist Red Army and the White Russian Army, which supported the Russian monarchy and old order institutions, Jews would pay a heavy price. Johnson writes that, quote, the consequences for Jews, both immediate and long-term, both locally and worldwide, were appalling. The White Russian Army, seeking to destroy the Soviet regime, treated all Jews as enemies. In the Ukraine, the civil war developed into the most extensive pogrom in Jewish history. There were more than 1,000 separate incidents involving the killing of Jews. Over 700 communities in the Ukraine were involved, and several hundred more in Russia. Between 60,000 and 70,000 Jews were murdered. In other parts of Eastern Europe, a similar identification of Jews with Bolshevism led directly to murderous attacks on harmless Jewish communities. They were particularly bloody in Poland after the failure of the Bolshevik invasion, and in Hungary after the fall of the Bela Kun regime. They occurred intermittently in Romania throughout the 1920s. In all 3 countries, the local communist parties had been largely created and run by non-Jewish Jews. And in each case, it was the unpolitical, traditional, observant Jews of the ghettos and villages who paid the penalty. End quote. Again, it needs to be stressed, as Johnson just mentioned, quote, in all 3 countries, the local communist parties have been largely created and run by non-Jewish Jews, end quote. Thus, it is quite understandable how so many, like Hitler, Churchill, and many Europeans, came to associate and equate Jews with communism, Bolshevism, etc. We are now in a position to fully appreciate the Jewish founder of political Zionism, Theodor Herzl's wisdom when he summarizes, quote, "We are what the ghetto made us. We have attained preeminence in finance because medieval conditions drove us to it. The same process is now being repeated. We are again being forced into finance. Now it is the stock exchange, by being kept out of other branches of economic activity. Being on the stock exchange, we are consequently exposed afresh to contempt. At the same time, we continue to produce an abundance of mediocre intellects who find no outlet, and this endangers our social position as much as does our increasing wealth. Educated Jews, without means, are now rapidly becoming socialists. Hence, we are certain to suffer very severely in the struggle between classes, because we stand in the most exposed position in the camps of both socialists and capitalists." End quote. We must emphasize that socialist communist ideology, rooted on easy to absorb economic fallacies, was already occurring in the Western world and can be seen as an almost inevitable mistake as mankind tried to make sense of the workings of the social order economy, which was quickly growing in bewildering complexity. Jews were inadvertently in a position to be more attracted to socialism and capitalism and be leaders in both. They obviously did not invent or plot socialism, communism, capitalism, like Hitler and many others to this day claim. It could be said that they were naturally selected to be socialist, capitalist, finance leaders, thus giving the impression that they were its creators or plotters. Jewish involvement in such movements was indeed the result of human action, but not the execution of any human design. If the Jews were smart enough to plot the numerous things the non-Jewish world accuses them of, they would have been smart enough to realize that socialism, communism was a disaster for Jew and non-Jew alike, and have been telling everyone about fellow Jew Ludwig von Mises. Both mankind's utter ignorance of the workings of the socioeconomic order and its evolution, as well as antisemitism and the Jew-Gentile conflicts, can be seen as outgrowth of the same sort of economic ignorance, and must be dealt with accordingly. With the above in mind, we are almost ready to analyze our current situation. But first, a few words about World War I. In August 10, 1915, British physicist Henry Moseley, who would have probably won the Nobel Prize that year, died in perhaps the most disastrous error mankind has thus far made, the First World War, 1914 to 1918. Bright and pious German, French, British, Russian students, fathers, engineers, great minds, and experts, who even shared a common European Christian faith, reverted to their tribal ape-like nature and for God, honor, flag, and country, slaughtered each other, leading to about 18 million deaths. At 7:30 a.m. July 1st, 1916, the Battle of the Somme began. On this single day, just the British alone had about 20,000 fatalities and 35,000 wounded. On that day, a British soldier was either killed or wounded on average every second. The honor of a military career would lead to disproportionately higher losses for the upper classes for all belligerents. Germany's top general, Erich Ludendorff, would lose 2 sons, as would future British Prime Minister Andrew Bonar Law. British Prime Minister at the start of the war, Herbert Asquith, lost 1, while about 12% of British troops would die in the war. 31% of Oxford's 1913 graduating class would die. This should help abolish the popular naive myth that politicians are quick to bring about wars while wanting to avoid personal losses in them. Nonsense, unfortunately. We are dangerous tribal animals who have been butchering each other for millions of years. Segregating ourselves into groups for slaughter has been the norm. We shouldn't be shocked when men murder, rape, and torture, or masturbate to tentacle porn. The real miracle that has taken thousands of years of cultural legal evolution to create are the modern cultural values and laws we absorb that program us into respecting the body, property, thoughts of all men, of all human beings, regardless of age, sex, belief, and race. Being the slightly smarter apes that we are, fellow humans are our biggest assets, which help explain the evolution of altruism and compassion due to the great benefits we get at the group level and horrendous violence towards fellow men, since we are our biggest competitors. Given its importance, War and patriotism easily fills us with a great sense of purpose. England's Prime Minister during World War II and national hero Winston Churchill shows us how inspiring, exciting, and purposeful World War I was to him when he mentioned, "I think a curse should rest on me, because I love this war. I know it's smashing and shattering the lives of thousands every moment, and yet I can't help it. I enjoy every second of it." And in another occasion, Churchill mentions, "My God, this is living history. Everything we are doing and saying is thrilling. Why, I would not be out of this glorious, delicious war for anything the world could give me." Towards the end of World War II, Russia's Red Army is estimated to have raped over 2 million German women. Equally human, the Allies, Americans, weren't much better and generally saw the Japanese as an inferior race and cared little for their suffering or views. As US President who nuked Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Harry S. Truman mentions in a letter, "The only language they seem to understand is the one we have been using to bombard them. When you have to deal with a beast, you have to treat him as a beast." How can mankind build mind-bogglingly complex microchips, smartphones, the internet, and so much more, yet still not have figured out something as simple as peace? Why is it that every day at Microsoft, I interact with co-workers from Russia, China, Iran, Israel, yet our tribalistic governments are mired in conflict? Is there something to be learned from the fact that in July 1914 so many people, Henrys, leaders, experts, brainwashed themselves for 4 years into such needless carnage, yet hardly anyone today has the slightest clue why World War I was fought? Everyone in that tribal disaster died for absolutely nothing. Similarly, is there something to be learned from the fact that with the best of intentions and guided by numerous bright intellectuals, millions during the 20th century fell for socialism, communism, thus inadvertently bringing unimaginable suffering upon themselves? And that to this day, hardly anyone in the entire planet knows why communism is 100% impossible to implement without it leading to socioeconomic chaos and famine? Yes, there is much to be learned. But for now, we will mention that human beings are dangerous tribal animals, whose economic ignorance, if not remedied in time, would lead to a final disaster. The relative freedom and socioeconomic prosperity that we have enjoyed in the West for just a few generations has been a slight cultural mutation from the law of the jungle our despotic and uncivilized instincts are very used to, and the coronavirus is in all likelihood one of these potentially totally man-made, tribalistic, and ultimately economically ignorant disasters like the prior two. We reach the present. We begin with the most important point. The economic fallacies and perverse incentives which critically led to the formation of the Soviet Union are still very much with us. New potential problems like global pollution, man-made environmental impacts, the alleged potential for some pathogen to spread via our interconnected world and wipe out millions of people, and numerous other concerns intensify and accelerate the spread of central planning fallacies. The overpopulation economic fallacy is also rapidly spreading and is one of the most dangerous. Mankind benefits from way more people, not less. Basically, the more brains, the smarter and more technologically advanced the global supercomputer becomes, making it easier to take care of the environment, and so on. Our transition from just larger-brained apes in our tribal world to market process coordinated global socioeconomic order or social organism is as significant in the evolution of life and the continuous increase in complexity of this on this planet as the transition from single-cell to multicellular life which occurred about 1 billion years ago. Perhaps someday in the future, we could recreate the habitats of species that are dying now and bring them back to life. We are the saviors of all life in this planet, not the destroyers. I mean, we could be the destroyers. We are natural selection's latest and greatest creation. But again, without the proper understanding of the market process, we always fall for coercive and economically disastrous central planning. Given mankind's current ignorance of how the socioeconomic order works and has evolved, Mises and Hayek are still not mainstream, which is something that has potentially little to do with race. It is quite understandable how various race-related fallacies which equate civilization with white people and race, like British European imperialism and later Nazism, dominated much of the last few centuries and are still very influential today. The fact that modern capitalism arose in Europe, which is populated by white people, and took them to relative prominence for a while, is adding yet another polarizing fallacy to the usual economically ignorant anti-capitalist sentiment. The relative technological lead that capitalism brought whites easily explains their fallacious racist ideologies which justified their slavery and conquests. Historian Hunt Tooley summarizes the thinking of the times when he writes, quote, European states had the right to conquer peoples because they were inferior and needed organizing for the good of the human race. And advanced states had the duty to conquer these people in order to pull them upward, at least some distance, toward the civilized level already reached by the Europeans. As British imperialist Cecil Rhodes put it in 1877, I contend that we are the finest race in the world, and that the more of the world we inhabit, the better it is for the human race. End of Tooley's quote. During the American occupation of the Philippines, Senator Albert J. Beveridge gives us another example of the mindset of the day when he said, quote, my own belief is that there are not 100 men among them who comprehend what Anglo-Saxon self-government even means, and there are over 5 million people to be governed. It has been charged that our conduct of the war has been cruel. Senators, it has been the reverse. Senators, we must remember that we are not dealing with Americans or Europeans. We are dealing with Orientals. End quote. Religious explanations also abounded. For example, Beveridge also reflected widely held views when he said that, quote, God has not been preparing the English-speaking and Teutonic peoples for 1,000 years for nothing but vain and idle self-contemplation and self-admiration. No, he has made us master organizers of the world to establish system where chaos reigns. He has given us the spirit of progress to overwhelm the forces of reaction throughout the earth. He has made us adepts in government that we may administer government among savage and senile peoples. Were it not for such a force as this, the world would relapse into barbarism and night. And all of our race, he has marked the American people as his chosen nation to finally lead the regeneration of the world. This is the divine mission of America, and he holds for us all the profit, all the glory, all the happiness possible to man. We are trustees of the world's progress, guardians of its righteous peace. End quote. This sort of thinking, coupled with the fact that there are only so many quote-unquote backward people whose lands could be plundered and civilized, eventually created the tensions that would lead to World War I. It is unfortunate that such disastrous fallacies dominated the thinking of the times. But what can we do? We are, after all, slightly smarter apes. Fortunately, such fallacies were widely overcome and is a process that to various degrees is still happening. Certainly, at least some white people erroneously believe that civilization and prosperity is somewhat or somehow tied to their race, and understandably so, these people tend to be more against immigration, which rightly bothers those like myself who favor more freedom to immigrate to the US, Europe, and everywhere. Again, as just discussed, race is relatively insignificant. Just a few thousand years ago, all of our ancestors were uncivilized tribalistic rapists and murderers. Although it is certainly true that there must be differences in mental ability just like there are differences in physical ones, whatever minute differences might exist are largely irrelevant. The explosion in relative human prosperity and technology mankind has stumbled upon during the last 2,000 years has little to do with biological differences and much more to do with the expansion of the global division of labor and information, free trade, competition, capitalism, etc. Just like ignorance of economics and biology had the white man of the 1700s mistakenly bossing around non-whites, the same ignorance has mankind intensifying socioeconomic chaos and damaging race relations. To one economically ignorant faction, the political left, Democrats, liberals, the political right, Republicans, conservatives, is just the racist white man who uses capitalism to exploit and maintain the status quo for his benefit, and Donald Trump and all the other white conservative leaders are the perfect embodiment of this fact. End quote. I made that up, but it sums it up pretty well. That's pretty much it. It is so-called identity politics, where the racist white man oppresses or discriminates against various groups, identities, women, minorities, and so on, and overturning such supposed political and economic oppression is what is needed to fix the world's problems by sharing more wealth and funding social programs that treat everyone fairly, equitably, and supposedly fix what they perceive are the inherent problems, instabilities, injustices of free markets or capitalism. Understandably so. to the so-called left, human nature is bad. It obviously leads to greed and exploitation, etc. And obviously, we need an all-powerful government controlled by experts and well-intentioned people to properly educate and coerce mankind into goodness, because freedom obviously leads to injustices, imperialism, etc. I mean, we do have history to look at, right? What could possibly be more obvious? Their economic ignorance is unaware of how freedom does the opposite. It puts immense pressure on us to treat and serve everyone equally and as productively and efficiently as possible. But again, for very understandable reasons, the slightly smarter apes without an understanding of economics always fall for civilization-destroying socialism. Many white liberals, with the best of intentions, might be ashamed of the imperialist past of their ancestors or of the racism of their parents, uncles, etc., and erroneously believe that such a past and racism is a significant factor in the relative underachievement or problems of other groups, minorities, blacks, etc. These are the increasing number of whites and liberals who essentially believe that racism towards blacks must be the overwhelming factor in their relative poverty suffering and are willing to tolerate any additional tax or government program which can supposedly fix the problems, and are also willing to look the other way as an understandably frustrated blacks and their well-meaning white supporters riot to force some kind of change. This focus on racism is a gigantic intellectual error. The relative damage done by whatever racism towards minorities an increasingly dwindling number of racist white men might have is incomparable to and exacerbated by the horrendous economic ignorance that leads to things like minimum wage laws, the truly racist war on drugs and resulting mass incarceration, the perverse incentives that arise out of numerous welfare schemes, and socialists share the wealth via massive government monopoly policies. But the economically ignorant masses are understandably focused on whatever racism they can and do find, which further intensifies their misguided socialist economic policies and blame of the white man, which understandably further increases the polarization that is tearing our nation apart. So again, both groups are wrong. If a human being can grow up and learn something as complex as a language, which can take even the brightest of people years to master, everyone has more than enough intelligence to understand the basics of how freedom, privatization, and open borders are the keys to rapid socioeconomic progress. Clever economic education and marketing is obviously the key. The overwhelming factor in the relative underachievement of minorities compared to whites, especially African Americans, is simply due to the fact that blacks find themselves, due to obvious historical factors like slavery and ongoing racism, in an environment where the economic fallacies which lead to central planning and socialism, take from others to redistribute equally via huge monopolistic government bureaucracies, are even more convincing and viral. If white people, and pretty much every slightly smarter ape, hates the rich and capitalism and wants to see redistribution of wealth via government experts as the solution to every problem, it makes perfect sense that such a sentiment would be much stronger with blacks. For example, perhaps America's most famous black leader, Martin Luther King, like most other prominent black political leaders and intellectuals, had little understanding of economics, and for reasons already hinted at, his socioeconomic views lean more towards socialism. One of today's leading mainstream African American intellectuals, Michael Eric Dyson, another socialist, writes, quote, King also contended in 1967 that, quote, the roots of economic injustice are in the system rather than in men or faulty operations. In a remarkable statement in a speech he gave to his staff in 1966, King laid out the ideological basis for his deepened assault on poverty, economic injustice, and class inequality. Quote, we are now making demands that will cost the nation something. You can't talk about solving the economic problem of the Negro without talking about billions of dollars. You can't talk about ending the slums without first saying profit must be taken out of slums. You're really tampering and getting on dangerous ground because you are messing with folk then. You are messing with the captains of industry. Now this means that we are treading in difficult waters, because it really means that we are saying that something is wrong with capitalism. There must be a better distribution of wealth, and maybe America must move toward a democratic socialism. End of King's quote. Back to Eric Dyson. This statement is remarkable since King rarely allowed his positive response to democratic socialism to be recorded. His usual practice, according to one of his aides, was to demand that they turn off the tape recorder while he expounded on the virtues of, quote, what he called democratic socialism, and he said, I can't say this publicly, and if you say I said it, I'm not going to admit to it. King didn't believe that capitalism, as it was constructed, could meet the needs of poor people. End of Dyson's quotes. So understandably, Martin Luther King had to keep his socialist socioeconomic views under wraps, but it was hard to conceal the fact that he was often surrounded by communists. Another famous black leader, Malcolm X, sent a letter to President Truman letting him know that, quote, I have always been a communist, end quote. Perhaps the most famous international black leader, South Africa's Nelson Mandela, who won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1993, is also a socialist ideologue. In a statement at the beginning of the trial that would send him to jail for 27 years, he said, begin quote, we all accept the need for some form of socialism to enable our people to catch up with the advanced countries of this world and to overcome their legacy of extreme poverty. I should tie myself to no particular system of society other than socialism, end quote. The Black Lives Matter organization, which has been taken to almost religious-like reverence by so many well-meaning people, is also, understandably, a communist organization. Black Lives Matter founder Patrice Cullors explained that, quote-unquote, we're trained Marxists, end quote. These black leaders, intellectuals, should not be blamed for the fact that they have inadvertently pushed America in the wrong socioeconomic direction and have helped keep Africa devastatingly poor. We want to understand the complex environmental factors that lead to the economic fallacies, which then manifest themselves in the more obvious tribal identities of socialists, communists, etc., and place the blame on such fallacies instead of blaming the current identities of people, which can easily change with the proper understanding of economics. I guess one of the many lessons we can learn from the history of socialism and communism is further reassurance of the fact that we are all slightly smarter apes, equally susceptible to tribalistic economic ignorance that leads to coercive central planning and socialism as opposed to freedom and competitive knowledge discovery. The supposedly very smart Jews fell for communism really hard. So did the pasty white Russians. So did the supposedly smarter Asians and Chinese. And sadly, even the Cubans too. If mankind survives the coronavirus-related socioeconomic chaos, it will be seen as another totally unnecessary man-made calamity based on the usual economic fallacies that led to communism and just sheer tribalistic hatreds, which the slightly smarter apes are easily susceptible to and kept them and their great leaders and experts slaughtering each other for 4 years during the First World War. Regardless of what exactly the CB pathogen is, and all the technical scientific details about it, the initial scare and lockdowns were based on a quickly revised and later totally discredited epidemiological model, which grossly overestimated the lethality of the coronavirus by British professor Neil Ferguson, who had made numerous totally bogus and exaggerated predictions before, like that up to 50,000 people would likely die from exposure to mad cow disease in beef in the UK, only 177 died. That up to 150 million people could be killed from bird flu. Only 282 died worldwide during 2003 to 2009. That swine flu could lead to 65,000 deaths in the UK. Only 457 died. That up to 150,000 people could die from foot and mouth disease scare. There were fewer than 200 deaths. We must highlight the fact that all of these so-called diseases, which led to such ultimately overhyped and totally unnecessary fears and restrictions like mad cow, bird flu, swine flu, foot and mouth, and ultimately the coronavirus disease as well, all seem to involve what we commonly refer to as viruses, which are so small that even with our best electron microscopes, their alleged functioning and interactions with the mind-bogglingly complex immune system remain the subject of much research and competing opinions. Wherever there is complexity, there is bound to be uncertainty. If the experts' understanding of these flus, pathogens, viruses, and our modern technology were anywhere as great as people assume, the much recommended flu vaccine would at least work on most people, but it does not even prevent the flu on less than half of the people who get it. By March 26, 2020, when the draconian lockdowns were just beginning in the USA, well-meaning scholars who never recognized the offspring they produced, like top US infectious disease expert Dr. Anthony Fauci, co-authored a paper in which he admitted, the case fatality rate may be considerably less than 1%. This suggests that the overall clinical consequences of COVID-19 may ultimately be more akin to those of a severe seasonal flu, which has a case fatality rate of approximately 0.1%. End quote. It quickly became obvious that the people who were dying were not necessarily dying because of coronavirus. They were simply testing positive for it at the time of death. And the overwhelming majority were very old and had multiple other illnesses and likely to die anyway. For example, a whopping 98.1% of the people who were labeled as dying from coronavirus in Massachusetts had at least one serious other health condition. In Italy, the average age was 78 years old and had almost 3 other serious illnesses. By early April, antibody testing, which helped identify people who had already dealt with the CV pathogen, quickly made it obvious that the lethality was that similar to a seasonal flu, yet the lockdowns intensified. Just like with communism, anyone could simply look and see that the non-communist countries were doing better. So could people easily see that countries like Sweden, Belarus, Nicaragua, Japan, and even within their own provinces, which might not have had lockdowns like South Dakota in the United States, were doing comparatively well or even better than lockdown countries. By May 26, 2020, official stats reached over 100,000 deaths from coronavirus in the United States, many of which were fraudulent. For example, even the Washington state government has admitted that people dying of gunshot wounds have been counted as coronavirus deaths. One could easily hypothesize that the true lethality is easily less than 10% of the 100,000 given the above, what has just been mentioned. There are many other factors that can easily show that the number is much smaller, but I will not even go there. So after 3 months of corona hype, over 99.997% of Americans have survived the pandemic. Yet over this completely overhyped tribalistic runaway complex of fallacies and perverse incentives, which are similar to the tribalism that led to World War I and Lenin's communist revolution, not only are the slightly smarter tribalistic apes heading towards socioeconomic chaos as a bunch of economically ignorant politicians try to cope with 40+ million unemployed while continuing disastrous regulations, a dangerous horde of tribal politicians wants to blame and nearly start a war with China over this as well. Just like perverse incentives had young Russians joining the Bolsheviks and inadvertently expanding central planning misery, so is the coronavirus scare. Many people with good intentions believe that even if there is a significant economic price to pay, that if the lockdown saved lives, it would have been worth it, especially those who have government jobs like public school teachers, etc., who get to be heroes and take a taxpayer-funded vacation at the same time. Just like during World War I, the wise people who knew that there was no need to run across trenches for God and country to slaughter fellow human beings were sent to prison for desertion. And the communists killed people who didn't want to go along for being selfish and not wanting to share the wealth equally, etc. We see the same tribalistic mentality among many in their desire to vilify those who just want to go back to work and feel like all of this is just one big mistake. So what must we do? We must become Misesians. We must understand basic economics and help fellow citizens overcome the economic fallacies that plunge us into tribalistic wars and socioeconomic order-destroying central planning. If we are to have a worldwide free market intellectual revolution that can quickly save mankind and reach the amazing peace and prosperity we are truly capable of, and in a matter of months, not years or generations, we must find, join, persuade people who are thoroughly convinced that such quick prosperity can be achieved and thus become beacons of hope, excitement, and viral economic education. We must join Mises and go over the parapet in his quote-unquote intellectual battle against the economic ignorance that threatens civilization. As Mises writes, everyone carries a part of society on his shoulders. No one is relieved of his share of responsibility by others. And no one can find a safe way out for himself if society is sweeping towards destruction. Therefore, everyone, in his own interest, must thrust himself vigorously into the intellectual battle. None can stand aside with unconcern. The interests of everyone hang on the result. Whether he chooses or not, every man is drawn into the great historical struggle, the decisive battle into which our epoch has plunged us. Just like socialism, communism, and our big government problems are caused by viral economic fallacies and resulting perverse incentives that inadvertently lead to bigger government growth and thus more coercion of wealth from the private sector, so too should we focus on viral bits of economic wisdom. It would seem wise to focus on those ideas that can both explain the most as quickly as possible and also cause enough doubt on what the current crop of clueless experts are recommending, essentially more regulation, planning, and central bank socialism by creating money to manage the social order. Henry Hazlitt wisely identified a focus on the basics of monetary policy and inflation because it is easy to understand, teach, and immediately lets people know that it is the central banks that are responsible for the inflation, rising prices, and general growth in government. Hayek's focus on how competition leads to spreads information and superior order and how governments prevent or slow down this process is also easy and a powerful way to get people closer to the proper understanding of how private property leads to economic freedom, which leads to competition and superior order. There is no reason why famous athletes and movie stars and others of influence can't understand basic economics and be likewise motivated to spread the econo-gospel. Unimaginable peace and prosperity are just around the corner. We just have to help our fellow citizens lose the fear of economic freedom and thus economic ignorance. The bigger the tax cut, the bigger the job losses and wages in the public sector will be, but just as quickly, the bigger the job gains and wages will be in the private sector, as taxpayers now have that additional wealth to keep and to now spend in the private sector, thus expanding it. All that will happen is that a public sector employee loses his public sector job and quickly finds a private sector one. Instead of getting his paycheck and wealth by coercing the taxpayer as part of a massively inefficient government monopoly and thus providing very little in return, he now joins a much more productive private sector order or company that is growing, hiring, because taxpayers are now giving them more business, money, wealth with which to hire and sustain him. All wealth that is given by government has to be taken away coercively or sneakily via inflation from others who in a sense gave up a part of their lives to produce it. Whenever you get something from the government, you are essentially consuming another person's life and order. This is not some moralist crusade against government. We just want to understand and minimize such inefficient coercion, which when properly understood, most of us will find it immoral. The better the people understand economics, the more they will be willing to go along with these transitions to skyrocketing prosperity, even those who currently have relatively well-paying government jobs. Again, economic education is the key. Besides viral economic education, perhaps the three most pressing issues confronting us now are: the tribalistic warmongering with China must be calmed. Just like with World War I, at some point any talk about peace and getting along will just be seen as treason. This is what the apes always fall for. You can be sure that the war is good for the economy fallacy is spreading through the minds of the economically ignorant, slightly smarter apes that run all governments, especially as the coronavirus-related socioeconomic disaster intensifies. Citizens must be awoken to the real pressing danger that nuclear war is. Second, the 40+ million unemployed can get back to work and on a path to unimaginable peace and prosperity in a few weeks. What is the problem we are trying to solve? We need to order those 40+ million in a manner that they are guided by the most productive knowledge, so that they produce as much wealth as possible, so that they can consume and enjoy as much wealth as possible. The only way to discover how to do this is via economic freedom. Right now, I could easily hire 50 people in my building for $1 an hour and rent them out to give massages, do laundry, deliveries, etc. However, competition from other entrepreneurs, brains, CPUs, who have superior time and place-specific information would pay them more and thus lure them away from my inferior and less productive plans, so that very quickly everyone would be incorporated in the most profitable plans the millions of competing brains can come up with. It is, of course, vitally important that minimum wage laws are abolished, so we allow all profitable ideas and restructurings to occur. The coronavirus lockdowns have led to more consumption than production, thus obviously shrinking the economic pie. The less seed a farmer has to plant for the next crop, the smaller the crop will be. Since there exists less wealth, the wealth that can be traded for people's labor will be smaller, and therefore people should expect lower wages. Most of the 40+ million people who have lost their jobs would probably be able to work in the same companies as before if they are wise enough to accept correspondingly lower pay. Most of us have been made poorer. We will have less wealth to trade for meals at restaurants, which means less wealth on revenue for restaurants and correspondingly smaller wages if they are to remain profitable and in business. Since many businesses, especially restaurants, already pay minimum or close to minimum wages, many will not be allowed to lower wages and have to stop producing altogether. Once again, minimum wage laws must be scrapped. When a business like an airline goes bankrupt and ownership assets are now in the hands of creditors, what usually happens is that the creditors are motivated to sell the business to a competitor who is likely to have the best ideas, information, leading to profitable use of resources, labor, and will thus typically be the highest bidder for the old airplanes and business. That's all. Financiers and investors take losses, and often employees also see their wages reduced as part of a now profitable company order. Economic education is obviously the most important thing needed to allow the necessary freedom for this to happen. Third, the disastrous and racist war on drugs must be ended immediately and everyone in jail because of it freed. A proper understanding of economics is vital for really understanding the immense cancer that this is in society, and especially African Americans. Many people like mind-altering substances, drugs, alcohol, etc. Mankind always has, and they have played an important role in cultural evolution, since getting high was an important way to interact with the spirit world, which played a vital role in the emergence of our religions, rules, laws, etc. Since many drugs are outlawed, but people still want them and are thus willing to trade money for them, their cost has to pay for the additional risks and consumption involved in their production, like the concealment, bribes to corrupt cops that will look the other way, and much more. This is why a kilogram of cocaine that may cost $200 to produce in a Bolivian jungle might sell for $20,000 in New York City. The relative higher price needed to cover such costs and consumption inevitably motivates people, especially poorer and less educated people, to enter the drug production and trafficking business. Eventually, these people get busted, which now forces taxpayers to pay over $31,000 per inmate, over $60,000 in California, and in New York City it is a whopping $168,000 per year to keep each drug dealer and user in jail. From 1984 to 1996, California built 21 new prisons and only one new university. In 2006, there were 1,889,810 drug-related arrests, of which almost 830,000 were related to just marijuana, which is relatively harmless and much less so than alcohol. Just try to imagine all the wealth that is consumed from society as we feed, clothe, and equip the criminal industrial complex as it does this useless function. Each drug bust and jailing of dealers, producers simply reduces the supply of drugs, which means that there is a smaller amount of wealth being chased by the same amount of money, so that their price simply goes up, once again increasing the motivation for people to become drug producers, traffickers, and dealers. This is a cycle that never ends and has nearly 500,000 Americans in jails at an enormous cost to taxpayers and causing horrible suffering and misery in poor Latin American countries where powerful drug cartels and businesses emerge, because the cost to not only manufacture the drugs is smaller, but to also avoid, bribe, terrorize the local police and citizens, which explains why countries like Mexico have so much drug-related violence. The US government further intensifies the suffering by taxing and taking wealth from Americans, to then arm and train the police in those countries to help crack down on the cartels, leading to brutal mini-civil wars. If drugs were legalized, instead of having millions of people consuming billions of dollars worth of wealth as they made a living doing the expensive and deadly aforementioned activities, cartels, prisons, you would simply get a small increase in the people employed in the pharmaceutical and agricultural industry, lowering their price to that of your average multivitamin. The money saved by drug users and taxpayers, since jails would no longer be needed, would now get spent in other areas, increasing employment and wages in those industries. The war on drugs allows racist white cops to inflict immense harm on the black community. Regarding the police abuse and racism, I'll just read a few revealing quotes. Harry J. Anslinger, the nation's first drug czar, before Congress in 1937 said, quote, "There are 100,000 total marijuana smokers in the U.S., and most are Negroes, Hispanics, Filipinos, and entertainers. Their satanic music, jazz and swing, result from marijuana use. This marijuana causes white women to seek sexual relations with Negroes. End quote. Again, there's much to discuss here, but just racism is really allowing and motivating these cops to inflict immense harm, and this war on drugs just must be ended immediately. It really gives us an opportunity to further help explain how an understanding of economics is vital for making sense of all of these disasters. Again, economic education is the key.
You see this? Put your right hand in the box.
What's in the box?
Pain. Stop. Put your hand in the box. I hold at your neck a gomja bar. This one kills only animals.
Are you suggesting that Duke's son is an animal?
Let us say, I suggest you may be human. Your awareness may be powerful enough to control your instincts. Your instinct will be to remove your hand from the box. If you do so, you die. You will feel an itching there. Now, the itching becomes burning. Heat upon heat upon heat. Silence! Silence!
I must not fear. Fear is the mind killer. Fear is the little death that brings total obliteration. I will face my fear. I will permit it to pass over me and through me. I must not
Feel flesh.
I do feel a crisping. Fear is the death that brings total obliteration. I will face my
Flesh. Dropping off.
fear. Fear is the little death. I must not fear. Fear is the little death. I must. The pain!
Enough!
We're all slightly smarter and potentially very dangerous apes. We either become civilized smarter apes by overcoming our tribalism and understanding how freedom and tolerance leads to civilization, or we remain uncivilized and thus keep rolling the dice until we finally destroy ourselves. Fortunately, natural selection keeps selecting. Perhaps there are other planets where their slightly smarter apes became civilized in time. What a shame that we are about to destroy the world, even though Mises, Hayek and friends already explained it all. These men's ideas can no longer remain ahead of our times. As Mises predicted, either we succeed in spreading them to the immense majority, or there is no hope left for mankind. As I wrap things up here, I'd like to read what else? Another Mises quote. The body of economic knowledge is an essential element in the structure of human civilization. It is the foundation upon which modern industrialism and all the moral, intellectual, technological, and therapeutical achievements of the last centuries have been built. It rests with men whether they will make the proper use of the rich treasure with which this knowledge provides them, or whether they will leave it unused. But if they fail to take the best advantage of it and disregard its teachings and warnings, they will not annul economics. They will stamp out society and the human race. Please visit votebesada.com to learn more about my congressional campaign. If you would like to help my campaign and help spread an understanding of economics, please share this video, especially to famous and influential people, and like and follow my campaign's Facebook page. I am running in Washington's 9th District, which includes offices of today's leading IT companies like Amazon, Google, and Microsoft. If we can just get the increasingly influential and powerful software world to truly understand economic freedom, we will finally triumph in our intellectual battle.